What employment it was thus to find what game it was actually to bring down this directed and aimed appetite for sharp impressions, is a question to which these pages 367 may appear in a manner to testify constituting, to that extent the proof of my fond calculation. It was in respect to the South meanwhile at any rate, that the calculation had really been fondestin, stored such a waiting provision of vivid images mainly beautiful, and sad might one surely, there depend the sense of these things would represent for the restless analyst more than that of any other's intensity of impression, so that his only prime discomfiture was in his having had helplessly to see his allowance of time cut short, reduced to the smallest compass, in which the establishment of a relation to any group of aspects might be held conceivable. This last soreness, however, and the point is one to be made, was not slow, I noted, to find itself healingly breathed upon more promptly in America than elsewhere. Does the relation to the group of aspects begin to work, whatever the group, and I think I may add whatever the relation may be, few elements of the picture are shy or lurking elements dangled among others, or hidden behind them, packed close by time and taking time to come out, they stand there in their row like the letters of an alphabet. And this is why, in spite of the vast surface exposed, any item encountered or selected contributes to the spelling of the word, becomes on the spot generally informing and characteristic. The word so recognized stands thus immediately for a multitude of others, and constitutes to expert observation an all-sufficient specimen, here evidently more quickly than in Europe. The visitor says to himself, one knows what there is, and what there isn't, whence there is the less need for one's impression of a multiplication of cases. A single case speaks for manna, since it is again and again, as he catches himself repeating a question not of clustered meanings that fall like overripe fruit into his lap, but of the picking out of the few formed features signs of character, mature enough and firm 368 enough to promise a savor, or to suffer handling these scant handfuls, illustrate and typify, and luckily, they are as the evidence of manners and conditions over the world goes quickly gathered, so that an impression founded on them is not an undue simplification, and I make out, I think, the reflection with which our anxious explorer tacitly concludes it's a bad country, to be stupid in none on the whole so bad, if one doesn't know how to look, and to see one should keep out of it altogether. But if one does, if one can see straight, one takes in the whole piece at a series of points that are after all comparatively few. One may neglect by interspacing the points a little of the accessory matter, but one neglects none of the essential, and if one has not at last learned to separate with due sharpness, pen in hand, the essential from the accessory, one has only at best to muffle one's head for shame and await deserved extinction. Roman 2. It was in conformity with some such induction as the foregoing that I had to feel myself at Richmond, in the midst of abnormal wintry rigors, take in at every pore a southern impression, just as it was also there before a picture charmless at the best I seemed to apprehend, and not redeemed now by mistimed snow and ice, that I was to recognize how much I had staked on my theory of the latent poetry of the South. This theory, during a couple of rather dark vain days, constituted my one solace or support, and I was most of all occupied with my sense of the importance of carrying it off again unimpaired. I remember asking myself at the end of an hour or two what I had then expected of the interesting Richmond, and thereupon, whether or no I 369 mustered on this first challenge an adequate answer, trying to supply the original basis of expectation by that effort. As happened, my dim perambulation was lighted, and I hasten to add that I felt the second branch of my question easy enough to meet. How was the sight of Richmond not to be a potent idea? How was the place not presumably to be interesting to a restless analyst who had become conscious of the charge involved in that title as long ago as at the outbreak of the Civil War, if not even still more promptly, and to whose young imagination the Confederate capital had grown lurid, fuliginous, vividly, tragic, specially under the process through which its fate was to close round it and overwhelm it. Invest it with one of the great reverberating historic names they hang together on the dreadful page. The cities of the supreme Holocaust, the final massacres, the blood, the flames, the tears, they are chalked with the sinister red mark, at sight of which the sensitive nerve of association forever winces. If the mere shadow had that penetrative power, what affecting virtue might accordingly not reside in the substances, the place itself, the haunted scene as one might figure it of the old, the vast intensity of drama? One thing at least was certain, that, however, the sense of actual aspects was to disengage itself, I could not possibly have drawn near with an intelligence more respectfully and liberally prepared for hospitality to it. So conformably, with all this, how could it further not strike me, in presence of the presented appearances, that the needful perceptions were in fact at play? I recall the shock of that question after a single interrogative stroll, a mere vague mile of which had thrown me back wondering, and a trifle mystified one had brutally to put it to oneself after a conscientious stare about this, then the tragic ghost-haunted city, this the center of the vast blood-drenched circle, one of the 370 most blood-drenched for miles and miles around in the dire catalogue, aforesaid. One had counted on a sort of registered consciousness of the past, and the truth was that there appeared for the moment, on the face of the scene, no discernible consciousness, registered or unregistered, of anything. Richmond, in a word, looked to me simply blank and void, whereby it was precisely, however, that the great emotion was to come. One could never consent merely to taking it for that intolerable the discredit so cast on one's perceptive resources. The great modern hotel, superfluously vast, was excellent, but it enjoyed as a feature, as a value, an uncontested priority. It was a huge, well-pitched tent, the latest thing in tents, proclaiming in the desert the name of a new industry. The desert I have mentioned was more or less muffled in snow that furthered, I admit, the blankness. The wind was harsh, the sky sullen, the houses scarce, emphasized at all as houses. The southern character, in fine, was nowhere. I should doubtless have been embarrassed to say in what specific items I had imagined it would naturally reside, save in so far as I had attached some mystic virtue to the very name of Virginia, this instinctive imputation constituting by itself, for that matter, a symptom of a certain significance. I watched and waited, giving the virtue a chance to come out. I wandered far and wide, as far, that is, as weather and season permitted. They quite forbade, to my regret, the long drives involved in a visitation of the old battlefields. The shallow vistas, the loose perspectives, were as sadly simple as the faces of the blind. Was it practically but a question, then, deplorable thought of a poor northern city, with the bare difference that a northern city of such extent would, however stricken, have succeeded by some northern art in pretending to resources where otherwise were the old southern mansions on the wide verandas, and in 371, the rank sweet gardens of which northern resources had once been held so cheap. Well, I scarce remember at what point of my peregrination, at what quite vague, senseless street corner, it was that I felt my inquiry up to that moment rather embarrassing turn to clearness, and the whole picture place itself in a light in which contemplation might for the time find a warrant and a clue. I at any rate almost like to live over the few minutes in question for the sake of their relief and their felicity. So, retracing them, I see that the spring had been pressed for them by the positive force of one's first dismay, a sort of intellectual bankruptcy. This latter, that one felt one really couldn't afford. There were no references, that had been the trouble, but the reaction came with the sense that the large sad poorness was in itself a reference, and one by which 100 grand historic connections were on the spot, and quite thrillingly re-established what was I tasting of at that time of day, and with intensity, but the far consequences of things made absolutely majestic by their weight and duration. I was tasting mystically of the very essence of the old southern idea, the hugest fallacy, as it hovered there to one's backward, one's ranging vision, for which hundreds of thousands of men had ever laid down their lives. I was tasting of the very bitterness of the immense grotesque, defeated project extravagant, fantastic, and today pathetic in its folly of a vast slave state, as the old term ran, artfully, savingly isolated in the world that was to contain it and trade with it. This was what everything round me meant, that absurdity had once flourished there, and nothing immediately could have been more interesting than the lesson that such may remain for long years, the telltale face of things where such absurdities have flourished. Thus, by a turn of my 372 hand, or of my head, interest was evoked, so that from this moment I had never to let go of it. It was to serve again, it was to serve elsewhere, and in much the same manner all aspects straightway were altered by it, and the pious pilgrim came round again into his own. He had wanted, his scheme had fairly required this particular part of the country to be beautiful. He had really needed it to be. He couldn't afford in due deference to the intellectual economy imposed on him, its not being when things were grandly sad, accordingly said on the great scale, and with a certain nobleness of ruin, an element of beauty seemed always secured, even if one could scarce say why, which truth clearly would operate fortunately for the compromised South. It came back, agonate, was always after this fashion coming back, as if to make me extravagantly repeat myself to the quantity to be read into the American view in general, before it gives out an interest the observer, like a fond investor, must spend on it boldly, ingeniously to make it pay. And it may often thus remind one of the wonderful soil of California, which is nothing when left to itself, and the fine weather, but becomes everything conceivable under the rainfall. What would many an American prospect be? For him, the visitor bent on appreciation frequently wonders without his preliminary discharge upon it of some brisk shower of general ideas. The arid sand has in a remarkable degree the fine property of absorbing these latter, and then giving them back to the air in proportionate signs of life. There be blooming gardens, on the other hand, I take it, where the foliage of time is positively too dense for the general idea to penetrate, or to perchance, if too many ideas had already been concerned and involved, and there were nothing to do but to accept the complete demonstration. It was not 373 to this order at any rate, that my decipherable South was to belong, but Richmond at least began to repay my outlay from point to point as soon as the outlay had been made. The place was weak, adorably weak. That was the word into which the whole impression flowered. That was the idea, evidently, that all the rest of the way as well would be most brought home. That was the form, in short, that the interest would take the charm immense, almost august being in the long, unbroken connections of the case here obviously, would be the prime source of the beauty, since if to be sad was to be the reverse of blatant, what was the sadness taken all round, but the incurable aftertaste of the original vanity and fatuity, with the memories and penalties of which the very air seemed still charged. I had recently been studying a little the record, reading with other things the volume of his admirable history, in which Mr. James Ford Rhodes recounts the long preliminaries of the war, and shows us all, lucidly and humanely, the Southern mind of the mid-century in the very convulsions of its perversiteth conception, that almost comic in itself, was yet so tragically to fail to work that of a world rearranged, a state solidly and comfortably seated and tucked in the interest of slave-produced cotton. The solidity and the comfort were to involve not only the wide extension, but the complete intellectual, moral, and economic reconsecration of slavery, an enlarged and glorified, quite beatified application of its principle, the light of experience round about, and every fingerpost of history, of political and spiritual science, with which the scene of civilization seemed to bristle, had, when questioned, but one warning to give, and appeared to give it with an effect of huge derision, whereby was laid on the Southern genius the necessity of getting rid of these discords, and substituting for 374 the ironic face of the world an entirely new harmony, or in other words, a different scheme of criticism, since nothing in the slave scheme could be said to conform, that is, to the reality of things. It was the plan of Christendom, and the wisdom of the ages, that would have to be altered. History, the history of everything, would be rewritten ad usum Delphinith Dauphin being in this case the budding Southern mind. This meant a general and a permanent quarantine, meant the eternal Baudelarization of books and journals, meant in fine all literature and all art on an expurgatory index. It meant still further an active and ardent propaganda, the reorganization of the school, the college, the university, in the interest of the new criticism, the testimony to that thesis offered by the documents of the time, by state legislation, local eloquence, political speeches. The tone of the press strikes us today as beyond measure queer and quaint, and benighted innocent, above all stamped with the inalienable Southern sign, the inimitable rococo note. We talk of the provincial, but the provinciality projected by the Confederate dream, and in which it proposed to steep the whole helpless social mass, looks to our present eyes as artlessly perverse, as untouched by any intellectual tradition of beauty or wit as some exhibited array of the odd utensils or divinities of lone and primitive islanders. It came over one that they were there in the air. They had breathed precisely Loneven, the very best of the old Southerners, and looking at them over the threshold of approach, that poor Richmond seemed to form the real key to one's sense of their native scene, was in that very idea of their solitude and their isolation. Thus they affected one as such passive, such pathetic victims of fate, as so played upon and betrayed, so beaten and bruised by the old burden of their condition, that I found myself 375 conscious on their behalf of a sort of ingenuity, of tenderness. Their condition was to have waked up from far back to this thumping legacy of the intimate presence of the Negro, and one saw them not much less imprisoned in it and overdarkened by it today than they had been in the time of their so fallacious presumption the haunting. Consciousness thus produced is the prison of the southern spirit, and how was one to say as a pilgrim from afar that with an equal exposure to the embarrassing fact, one would have been more at one's ease? I had found my own threatened, I remember me ease of contemplation of the subject which was all there could be question, offering some 10 minutes, spent a few days before in consideration of an African type, or two, encountered in Washington. I was waiting in a cab at the railway station for the delivery of my luggage after my arrival, while a group of tatterdemalion darkies lounged and sunned themselves within range. To take in with any attention 2 or 3 of these figures had surely been to feel one's self introduced at a bound to the formidable question, which rose suddenly like some beast that had sprung from the jungle. These were its far outposts. They represented the southern black as we knew him not, and had not within the memory of man known him at the north. And to see him there ragged and rudimentary, yet all portentous, and in possession of his rights as a man, was to be not a little discomposed, was to be in fact very much admonished. One understood at a glance how he must loom, how he must count in a community in which, in spite of the ground it might cover, there were comparatively so few other things. The admonition accordingly remained, and no further appeal was required. I felt to disabuse a tactful mind of the urgency of preaching southward a sweet reasonableness about him. Nothing 376 was less contestable, of course, than that such a sweet reasonableness might play in the whole situation a beautiful part, but nothing also was on reflection more obvious than that the counsel of perfection in such a case would never prove oil upon the waters. The lips of the non-resident were at all events not the lips to utter this wisdom. The non-resident might well feel themselves, indeed, after a little appointed to silence, and with any delicacy see their duty quite elsewhere. It came to one soon enough by all the voices of the air that the Negro had always been, and could absolutely not fail to be intensely on the nerves of the South, and that, as in the other time, the observer from without had always as a tribute to this truth to tread the scene on tiptoe. So even yet in presence of the immitigable fact, a like discretion is imposed on him. He might depart from the discretion of old, if he were so moved intrusively, fanatically, even heroically, and he would depart from it today, one quite recognized, with the same effect of importunity, but not with the same effect of gallantry, the moral of all of which fairly became to my sense a soft inward dirge over the eternal false position of the afflicted South, condemned, as she was to institutions, condemned to a state of temper of exasperation and depression, a horrid heritage she had never consciously invited, that bound up her life with 100 mistakes and make-believe suppressions and prevarications, things that really all named themselves in the noted provincialism. None of them would have lived in the air of the greater world, which was the world that the North, with whatever abatements, had comparatively been and had conquered by being so. That if the actual visitor was conscious now, as I say, of the appeal to his tenderness, it was by this sight of a society still shut up in a world smaller 377 than what one might suppose its true desire, to say nothing of its true desert. I can doubtless not sufficiently tell why, but there was something in my whole sense of the South that projected at moments a vivid and painful image, that of a figure somehow blighted or stricken, discomfortably, impossibly seated in an invalid chair, and yet fixing one with strange eyes that were half a defiance and half a deprecation of one's noticing, and much more of one's referring to any abnormal sign. The deprecation in the Southern eyes is much greater today, I think, than the old lurid challenge, but my haunting similitude was an image of the keeping up of appearances, and above all of the maintenance of a tone, the historic high tone, in an excruciating posture. There was food for sympathy, and the restless analyst must repeat that, when he had but tasted of it, he could but make of it his full meal, which brings him back by a long way round to the grim street corner at Richmond, where he last left himself. Roman 3. He could look down from it, I remember, over roofs and chimneys, through some sordid gap, at an abased prospect that quite failed to beckon that of the James River, embanked in snow, and attended by waterside industries, that in the brown haze of the weather were dingy and vague. There had been an indistinct sign for him somewhere. There had stood the Libby prison, an indication that flung over the long years ever so dreary a bridge he lingered to take it in from so far away. It came, the strange apparition, in the dress of another day, and with the interest of noting at the same time how little it mattered for any sort of intensity, whether of regret or of relief, that the structure itself, 378, so sinister to the minds I should have materially vanished, it was still there enough to parade its poor ghosts. But the value of the ghosts precisely was that they consented all alike on either side to the grand epic dimness. I recognize, moreover, with the lapse of time, the positive felicity of my not having to connect them with the ruin of a particular squalid tobacco house. The concrete none the less did in the name of history await me, and I, indeed, recollect pursuing it with pertinacity for conscience' sake all the way down a wide steep street, a place of traffic of shops and offices, and altogether shabby Virginia vehicles, these last in charge of black teamsters, who now emphasized for me with every degree of violence that already apprehended note of the Negro really at home. It fades, it melts away, with a promptitude of its own, almost any random reflection of the American picture, and though the restless analyst has arts of his own for fixing and saving edas, he at least on occasion, fondly flatters himself, is too often reduced to wondering what it can have consisted of in a given case, save exactly that projected light of his conscience. Richmond there at least was a definite factis, a city of more or less noble precipitous hills, and he recalls of his visit to the avenue aforesaid no intellectual consequence whatever, but the aftersense of having remounted it again on the opposite side. It was in succession to this, doubtless, that he found himself consulting the obscure oracle of the old State House, or capital seat of the Confederate legislature, strange intellectual center of the general enterprise. I scarce know in what manner I had expected it to regale either my outward or my inward sense. One had vaguely heard that it was fine, and at the height, or in the key of the old Virginian dignity, the approach to it had been adorned from far back. Moreover, as one remembered with Crawford's celebrated monument to Washington 379, attended by famous Virginian switchwork. Indeed, I promptly perceived answered to its reputation with a high elegance that was quite of the mid-century, and yet that indescribably archaic made the mid-century seem remote and quaint, and queer as disconnected from us, as the prolific age of Cyprus, or of Crete. It is positive that of the old American sculpture about the Union, a rich study might be made. What shall I say of this spot at large, and of the objects it presented to view, if not that here, where all the elements of life had been most in fiery fusion, everything was somehow almost abjectly frigid, and thin the small, shapeless, square, ancient acropolitan seat, ill placed on its eminence, showed, I recollect, but a single figure in motion, that of a gentleman to whom I presently put a question, and who explained to me that the Capitol, masked all round in dense scaffolding, though without a laborer visible, had been very bad, a mere breakable shell, and was now from top to bottom in course of reconstruction. The shell, one could see, was empty and work suspended, and I had never truly, it seemed to me, seen a human institution so coldly and logically brought low as this memorial mass, anything rewritten so mercilessly small as this poor passage of a great historic text. The effect was as of a page of some dishonored author printed on gray paper with blunt type, and when I had learned from my informant that a fairly ample white house, a pleasant honest structure in the taste of 60 or 80 years since, had been Jefferson Davis' official residence during part of the war, every source of interest had been invoked, and had in its measure responded. The impression obeys, I repeat, a rigorous law. It irremediably fades, it melts away. But was there not further, as a feature of the scene, one of those decent and dumb American churches, which are so strangely possessed of the secret of minimizing 380 to the casual eye the general pretension of churches? The extent to which the American air affects one as a non-conductor of such pretensions is, in the presence of these heterogeneous objects, a constant lively lesson, looking for the most part no more established or seated than a stopped omnibus. They are reduced to the inveterate bourgeois level, that of private accommodated pretensions, merely and fatally despoiled of the fine old ecclesiastical arrogance. This, the richest attribute they elsewhere enjoy, keeps clear of them, only to betray them, so that they remind one everywhere of organisms trying to breathe in the void, or of those creatures of the deep sea who change color and shrink, as one has heard, when astray in fresh water. The fresh water makes them indeed pullulate, but to the loss of importance, and nothing could more have fallen in with that generalization for the restless analyst than the very moral of the matter, as he judged, lately put before him at the national capital Washington, already bristles for the considering eye with national affirmation, spig, builded forms of confidence and energy, but when you have embraced them all with the implication of all the others still to come, you will find yourself wondering what it is you so oddly miss. Numberless things are represented, and one interest after the other counts itself in the great congressional library, crowns the hill beside the Capitol the departments and institutes cover their acres and square their shoulders the obelisk to the memory of Washington climbs still higher. But something is absent more even than these masses are presential. It at last occurs to you that the existence of a religious faith on the part of the people is not even remotely suggested, not a federal dome, not a spire, nor a cornice pretends to any such symbolism. And though your attention is thus concerned with a mere 381 negative, the negative presently becomes its sharp obsession. You reach out perhaps in vain for something to which you may familiarly compare your unsatisfied sense. You liken it perhaps not so much to a meal, made savorless by the failure of some central dish, as to a picture nominally finished, say, where the canvas shows in the very middle with all originality, a fine blank space. For it is most doubtless the aesthetic appetite in you long richly fed elsewhere that goes unassuaged. It is your sense of the comprehensive picture as a comprehensive picture that winces for recognition of loss like a touched nerve. What is the picture collectively seen, you ask? But the portrait more or less elaborated of a multitudinous people of a social and political order, so that the effect is for all the world as if with the body, and the limbs, the hands and feet and coat, and trousers, all the accessories of the figure, showily painted the neat white oval of the face itself, were innocent of the brush. You marvel at the personage, you admire even the painting which you are largely reduced however to admiring in the hands, and the boots in the texture of accompanying tablecloth inkstand newspaper, introduced with a careless grace, and other paraphernalia. You wonder how he would look if the face had been done, though you have compensation meanwhile. I must certainly add in your consciousness of assisting as you apprehensively stand there at something new under the sun, the size of the gap, the intensity of the omission in the Washington prospect, where so much else is representative dots, with the last sharpness the distinct eye, as it were of one of the promptest generalizations of the repatriated absentee. The field of American life is as bare of the church as a billiardable of a centerpiece, a truth that the myriad little structures attended on Sundays, and on the off evenings of their sociables, 382 proclaim, as with the audible sound of the roaring of a million mice, or that analogy re-insists of, the difference between the deep sea of the older sphere of spiritual passion and the shallow tide, in which the inhabiting particles float perforce near the surface, and however one indicates one's impression of the clearance itself, in its completeness, with the innumerable odd connected circumstances that bring it home, represents in the history of manners and morals a deviation in the mere measurement of which hereafter may well reside a certain critical thrill. I say hereafter, because it is a question of one of those many measurements that would as yet in the United States be premature of all the solemn conclusions one feels as barred. The list is quite headed in the States, I think, by this particular abeyance of judgment, when an ancient treasure of precious vessels overscored with glowing gems and wrought artistically into wondrous shapes, has by a prodigious process been converted through a vast community into the small change, the simple circulating medium of dollars and nickels. We can only say that the consequent permeation will be of values of a new order, of what order we must wait to see. All of which remarks would constitute a long excursion, I admit, from the sacred edifice by the Richmond Street, were it not for that saving law, the enrichment of each hour on the American scene, that wings almost any observed object with a power to suggest a possible social porty, soaring, superior to its plain face, and I seem to recover the sense of a pretext for incurable mooning, then and there in my introduction, but little delayed to the next in the scant group of local lions, the usual place of worship, as I understood of the Confederate leader from his proper pew, in which Jefferson Davis was called on that fine Sunday morning of the springtime of 1865, by the news of Lee's surrender. The news had been 383 big, but the place of worship was small and linger in it, as one would fraternize as one would, with the mild old Confederate soldier survivor of the epic age who made by his account so lean a living of his office of sexton one, could but moodily resent again its trivialization of historia process. One scarce knows how to name its inaccessibility to legend perhaps, after all it represented in its comfortable denominational commonness, the right scene of concentration for the promoters of so barren a polity, that idea of the perpetual Southern quarantine, but no leaders of a great movement, a movement acclaimed by a whole nation, and paid for with every sacrifice, ever took such pains, alas, to make themselves not interesting. It was positively as if legend would have nothing to say to them, as if on the spot there I had seen it turn its back on them and walk out of the place. This is the horse ever that one may take to the water. But that drinks not against his will. That was at least what it came back to for the musing moralist. If the question is of legend, we dig for it in the deposit of history, but the deposit must be thick to have given it a cover, and let it accumulate it was on the battlefields, and in all the blood-drenched radius that it would be thick here decidedly in the streets of melancholy Richmond. It was thin just so since it was the planners and plotters who had bidden unsuccessfully for our interest. It was for the sacrificed multitude, the unsophisticated, irresponsible agents, the obscure, and the eminent alike, that distinction might be pleaded they were buried. If one would in the depositware, the restless analyst might scratch all tenderly to find them. He had fortunately at this moment his impression as to where under such an impulse he had best look, and he turned his steps, as with an appetite for some savor in his repast, still too much withheld, to that museum, 384 of the relics of the Confederacy, installed some years since in the eventual White House of Richmond, the executive mansion of the latter half of the war. Here positively the spirit descended, and yet all the more directly, it seemed to me strange to say, by reason of the very nudity and crudity, the historic, the pathetic poverty of the exhibition. It fills the whole large house, each of the leagued states enjoying an allotted space, and one assuredly feels in passing from room to room that up and down the South no equal area can so offer itself as sacred ground, tragically, indescribably sanctified these documentary chambers, that contained, so far as I remember, not a single object of beauty, scarce one in fact, that was not altogether ugly, so void they were of intrinsic charm, and that spoke only of the absence of means, and of taste, of communication and resource. In these rude accents they phrased their interest, which the unappeased visitor, from the moment of his crossing the general threshold, had recognized in fact as intense. He was at his old trick. He had made out on the spot, in other words, that here was a pale page into which he might read what he liked. He had not exchanged 10 words of civility with a little old lady, a person soft-voiced, gracious, mellifluous, perfect for her function, who, seated by her fire in a sort of official anteroom, received him, as at the gate of some grandly bankrupt plantation, had not surrendered to this exquisite contact before he felt himself up to his neck, in a delightful, soothing, tepid medium. The social tone of the South that had been it was but the matter of a step over. He was afloat on other waters and had remounted the stream of time. I said just now that nothing in the museum had beauty, but the little old lady had it, with her thoroughly sectional good manners, and that punctuality and felicity, that inimitability, one must again say of the South, in her, in the patriotic unction of her reference to 385, the sorry objects about which transported me as no enchanted carpet could have done. No little old lady of the North could, for the high tone and the right manner, have touched her, and poor benumbed Richmond might now be as dreary as it liked. With that small observation made, my pilgrimage couldn't be a failure. The sorry objects about were old Confederate documents, already sallow with time, framed letters, orders, autographs, extracts, tatters of a paper currency in the last stages of vitiation, together with faded portraits of faded worthies, primitive products of the camera, the crayon, the brush, of all of which she did the honors with a gentle, florid reverence that opened wide for the musing visitor as he lingered and strolled the portals, as it were, of a singularly interesting case. It was the case of the beautiful, the attaching oddity of the general Southern state of mind, or stage, of feeling in relation to that heritage of woe and of glory of which the mementos surrounded me. These mementos were the sorry objects, and as I pursued them from one ugly room to another, the whole place wearing the air, thus cumulatively, of some dim, dusty collection of specimens, prehistoric, Paleolithic, scientific, and making one grope for some verbal rendering of the gray effect, the queer elements at play wrote themselves, as large as I could have desired, on every side. I imagine from Virginia to Texas. The visitor must become aware of them. Visitor, that is, who, by exception, becomes aware of anything. Was I not, for instance, presently to recognize them at their finest, for an almost comic ambiguity in the passionate flare of the little frontal inscription, behind which the daughters of the Confederacy of the Charleston section nurse the old wrongs and the old wounds. These afflictions are still thus admirably ventilated, and what is wonderful in the air today is the comfort and 386 cheer of this theory of an undying rancor. Every facility is enjoyed for the publication of it. But as the generation that immediately suffered, and paid has almost wholly passed away. The flame-colored idea has flowered out of the fact, and the psychologic interest, is to see it so disengage itself as legend, as valuable, enriching, inspiring, romantic legend, and settle down to play its permanent part practically. And most conveniently one feels the South is reconciled, but theoretically, ideally, and above all for the new generation, and the amiable. The ladies amiable like the charming curatrix of the Richmond Museum, it burns with a smothered flame, as we meanwhile look about us there, over a scene as sad throughout, as some raw spring, eventide. We feel how something of the sort must in all the blankness respond morally and socially to a want. The collapse of the old order, the humiliation of defeat, the bereavement and bankruptcy, involved, represented with its obscure miseries and tragedies, the social revolution, the most unrecorded and undepicted, in proportion to its magnitude that ever was so that this reversion of the starved spirit to the things of the heroic age, the 4 epic years, is a definite soothing salvia sentiment, which has moreover in the South to cultivate itself intellectually from season to season the field over which it ranges, and to sow with its own hands such crops as it may harvest. The sorry objects at Richmond brought it so low the aesthetic level, it was impossible from room to room to imagine a community of equal size more disinherited of art, or of letters. These about one were the only echoes, daubs of portraiture, scrawls of memoranda, old vulgar newspapers, old rude uniforms, old unutterable mid-Victorian odds and ends of furniture, all ghosts, as of things noted at a country fair. The illiteracy seemed to hover like a queer smell. The social 387 revolution had begotten neither song nor storionly for literature 2 or 3 biographies of soldiers written in other countries, and only for music, the weird chants of the emancipated blacks, only for art. I was an hour later to add the monument to General Lee by Roman 1000 Mercy of Paris, but to that in its suburban corner, and to the strange eloquence of its isolation, I shall presently come. The moral of the show seemed to me meanwhile the touching inevitability in such conditions of what I have called the nursing attitude. What on earth nurse of a rich heroic, past nurse of a fierce, avenging future nurse of any connection that would make for any brood of visions about one's knee wouldn't one have to become? I found myself inwardly exclaiming, if one had this great melancholy void to garnish and to people, it was not under this reflection, the actual innocent flare of the altar of memory, that was matter for surprise. But that such altars should strike one, rather as few and faint, they would have been none too many for countenance and cheer, had they blazed on every hilltop. The Richmond halls at any rate appeared through the chill of the season scantly trodden, and I met in them no fellow visitor, but a young man of stalwart and ingenuous aspect, who struck me so forcibly, after a little as exhaling a natural piety, that, as we happened at last to be wrapped in contemplation of the same sad glass case, I took advantage of the occasion to ask him if he were a Southerner. His affirmative was almost eager, and he proved for all the world like the hero of a famous novella, gallant and nameless, as well as a very handsome young Virginian. A farmer by occupation, he had come up on business from the interior to the capital, and having a part of his morning on his hands, was spending it in this visitation made, as I gathered, by no means for the first time, but which he still found absorbing, as a son of the New South. He presented a lively interest of type linguistically 388, not least since, where doesn't the restless analyst grope for light end? This interest, the ground of my here recalling him, was promptly to arrive at a climax. He pointed out to me amid an array of antique regimentals certain objects identical with relics preserved in his own family, and that had belonged to his father, who, enrolled at the earliest age, had fought to the end of the war. The old implements before us bore the number of the Virginia regiment, in which this veteran had first seen service, and a question or two showed me how well my friend was acquainted with his parents' exploits. Enjoying apparent lifer, he was intelligent and humorous and highly conversable. The opportunity to talk of such things, they being as it were so advantageously present there, with a vague northerner, he related felicitously some paternal adventure of which I have forgotten the particulars, but which comprised a desperate evasion of capture, or worse, by the lucky smashing of the skull of a Union soldier. I complimented him on his exact knowledge of these old unhappy far-off things, and it was his candid response that was charmingly suggestive. Oh, I should be ready to do them all over again myself. And then, smiling serenely, but as if it behoved even the least blatant of Northerners to understand, that's the kind of Southerner I am. I allowed that he was a capital kind of Southerner, and we afterwards walked together to the public library, where on our finally parting I could but thank him again for being so much the kind of Southerner I had wanted. He was a fine contemporary young American incapable, so to speak, of hurting a northern fly as northern, but whose consciousness would have been poor and unfurnished without this cool platonic passion. With what other pattern personal views apart could he have adorned its bare walls? So I wondered till it came to me that though he wouldn't have hurt a northern fly, there were things, we had 389 touched on some of these, that all fair engaging smiling, as he stood there he would have done to a southern Negro. Roman 4s. The public libraries in the United States are like the universities, a challenge to fond fancy, by which I mean that if taken together they bathe the scene with a strange hard light of their own. The individual institution may often affect the strained pilgrim as a blessedly restful perch. It constitutes in its degree, wherever met, a more explicit plea for the amenities, or at least a fuller exhibition of them than the place is otherwise likely to contain, and I remember comparing them inwardly, after periods of stress and dearth, after long vacant stretches to the mastheads, on which spent birds sometimes alight in the expanses of ocean. Their function for the student of manners is by no means exhausted with that attributeth project through the use made of them 20 interesting sidelights, but it was by that especial restorative, that almost romantic character, I have just glanced at that, I found myself most solicited. It is to the inordinate value in the picture of the non-commercial, non-industrial, non-financial note, that they owe their rich relief being with the universities, as one never wearied of noting, charged with the whole expression of that part of the national energy that is not calculable in terms of mere arithmetic. They appeared to express it at times, I admit, the strange national energy, in terms of mere subjection to the spell of the last Seller's new novel, epidemically swift, the ubiquity of which so mirrors the great continental conditions of unity, equality, and prosperity. But this view itself was compatible with one's sense of their practical bid. For the effect of 390 distinction, there are 100 applications of the idea of civilization, which in a given place outside its library would be all wrong if conceivably attempted, and yet that immediately become right incur, in fact, the highest sanction on passing that threshold. They often more or less fail, of course. They sometimes completely fail to assert themselves even within the precinct, but one at least feels that the precinct attends on them, waits, and confessedly yearns for them, consents, indeed, to be a precinct, only on the understanding that they shall not be forever delayed. I wondered everywhere under stress of this perception, at the general associations of the word that best describes them, and that remains so quaintly and admirably their word, even when their supreme right in it is most vulgarly and loudly disputed. They are the rich presences, even in the rich places among the skyscrapers, the newspaper offices, the highly rented pews, and the billionaires, and they assert with a blessed imperturbable serenity not only that everything would be poor without them, but that even with them much is as yet deplorably poor. They in fact so inexorably establish this truth, that when they are in question, they leave little to choose. I think round about them between the seats of wealth and the seats of comparative penury, they are intrinsically so much more interesting than either. Was it then because Richmond at large, the old Richmond, seemed to lie there in its icy shroud, with the very dim smile of modesty, the invalid gentleness of a patient who has been freely bled? Was it through profit of this impression that the town library struck me as flushing with color and resource with confidence and temperament? The beauty of the matter is that these penetralia, to carry it off, as they do call to their aid of necessity, no great store of possessions play their trick. If they must with the mildest rarities, it sufficed 391 really at Richmond, that the solid structure ample and detached indeed, and keeping where it stood the best company, the place could afford should make the affirmation furthest removed from the vain vaunt of the other time, the pretense of a social order, founded on delusions and exclusions. Everything else was somehow, however indirectly, the bequest of that sad age, and partook more or less of its nature. This thing alone either had nothing to do with it or had to do with it, by an appealing, a quite affecting lapse of Legitch's Halfware's appreciation, of which had for the restless analyst a positive melancholy sweetness. The place had of course to be, in its way, a temple to the Confederate cause, but the charm in the spacious, handsome, convenient upper room, among books of value, and pictures of innocence, and glass cases of memorabilia, more refined than those of the collection I had previously visited, among gentle readers, transported and oblivious, and the still gentler specimens, if I rightly recollect, of the pale sisterhood of the appointed and attendant fair, who predominantly throughout the states minister to intellectual appetite and perform the intellectual service directing and controlling them, and as would appear triumphantly minimizing their scope, feminizing their two possible male grossnesses, charm I say, was now in the beautiful openness to the world relation, in the felt balm, really of the disprovincializing breath once such a summer air as that had begun softly to stir even the drearier little documents might flutter in it, as confederately as they liked the terrible framed canvases, portraits of soldiers and statesmen, strange images on the whole of the sectional grate, might seem to shake faintly on the wall as in vague protest, at a possible doom disinherited of art one could indeed in presence of such objects, but feel that the Old South had been, and might not this thin tremor, on the part of several of 392 those who had had so little care for it, represent some sense of what the more liberal day-so announced there on the spot might mean for their meager memories. This was a question, however, that it naturally concerned me not to put to the old mutilated Confederate soldier, who, trafficking in photographs in a corner of the room, rejoiced to proclaim the originals of the portraits. Nothing could have been a happier link than the old Confederate soldiera link, as from past to present and future, I mean even when individually addicted to voicing some of the more questionable claims of the past, what will they be at all events the Southern shrines of memory on the day the last old Confederate soldier shall have been gathered to his fate? Never thanks to a low horizon had the human figure, endowed with almost anything at all in the nature of a presence or a silhouette, such a chance to stand out, never had the pictorial accident on a vast gray canvas, such a chance to tell, but a different matter from these at Richmond. In fact, the greatest matter of all is the statue of General Lee, which stands high, aloft and extraordinarily by itself, at the far end of the main residential street, a street with no imputable character, but that of leading to it faithful experimentally to a desperate practice. I yet had to renounce herein the main residential street. Subtle effort to read a sense into the senseless appearances about me, this ranked I scarce know why as a disappointment I had presumed with a fond extravagance. I have hinted that they would give out here, and there's some unmistakable backward reference show from the old overclambered but dispeopled double galleries, that I might liken to desecrated cloisters, some wan faded face of shrunken gentility, frankly however with the best will in the world, really too good a will which found itself again, and again quite grimly snubbed. Frankly, I could do 393, nothing, everything was there. But the material, the disposition had been a tribute to old Virginia, but old Virginia, quite unceremoniously, washed her hands of me. I have spoken of scratching for romance, and all tenderly in the deposit of history, but plainly no deposit would show, and I tried to remember for fairness that Richmond had been after all but a modern and upstart capital. Indistinct there below the hill was the James River, and, away in the mists of time, romantic Jamestown, the creation of a Stuart king, that would have to do though it also in its way, was nothing for meanwhile. In truth, just hear her above all. And in presence of the monument, completing the vista were other things to remember, provoked reflections that took on their own intensity. The equestrian statue of the Southern hero, made to order in faraway, uninterested Paris, is the work of a master, and has an artistic interest, a refinement of style, in fact under the impression of which we seem to see it in its situation, as some precious pearl of ocean, washed up on a rude bare strand. The very high florid pedestal is of the last French elegance, and the great soldier sitting his horse with a kind of melancholy nobleness, raises his handsome head. As he looks off into desolate space, he does well, we feel, to sit as high as he may, and to appear in his lone survival, to see as far and to overlook as many things. For the irony of fate crowning, the picture is surely stamped in all sharpness on the scene about him. The place is the mere vague center of 2 or 3 crossways, without form, and void, with a circle half sketched by 3 or 4 groups of small new mean houses. It is somehow empty in spite of being ugly, and yet expressive in spite of being empty. Desolate one has called the air, and the effect is strangely of some smug up-to-date specimen or pattern of desolation, so long as one stands there 390 for the high figure which ends for all the world by suggesting to the admirer a quite conscious subjective, even a quite sublime effort to ignore, to sit as it were superior and indifferent, enjoys the fact of company, and thereby, in a manner of sympathizo, that the vast association of the feudal for the moment drops away from it, but to turn one's back one feels, is to leave it again alone, communing at its altitude, which represents thus some prodigious exemplary perched position, some everlasting high stool of penitence, with the very heaven of futility. So at least I felt brought round again to meeting my first surprise to solving the riddle of the historic poverty of Richmond. It is the poverty that is exactly historic, once take it for that, and it puts on vividness the condition attested, is the conditioner, as may be one of the later, fainter, weaker stages off, having worshipped false gods as I looked back before, leaving it at least stranded, bereft image, which time and fortune have so cheated of half the significance, and so I think of half the dignity of great memorials. I recognized something more than the melancholy of a lost cause. The whole infelicity speaks of a cause that could never have been gained. Roman 13. Charleston. To arrive at Charleston early in the chill morning was to appear to have come quite adventurously far, and yet to be not quite clear about the grounds of the appearance. Did it rest on impressions gathered by the way on the number of things one had been since leaving Richmond aware? Was it rather explained by the long succession of hours, the nights and days, consumed as mere tasteless time, and without the attending relish of excited interest? What definitely could I say? I had seen that my journey should already presume to give itself airs, to seat itself there, as a chapter of experience to consider of this question, was really, I think, after a little to renew one's appreciation of the mystery, and the marvel of experience that accretion may amount to an enormous sum often, when the figures on the slate are too few and too paltry, to mention it may count for enrichment. Without one's knowing why, and so again, on occasion with a long column of items, it may count for nothing at all. I reached Charleston ever so much, as it seemed to me the wiser, that is, for the impression of scarce distinguishable things. One made them out with no great brilliancy, as just Southern. But one would have missed the point I hastened to add in failing to see what an application, and what a value they derived from that name. One was already beginning. That was the Truthon's 396 convenient induction as to the nature of the South. And once that account was opened, how could everything great or small, positive or negative, not become straightway a contribution to it? The large negatives in America have, as well as other matters, their meaning and their truth. So what if my charged consciousness of the long way from Richmond were that of a negative modified by small discomforts? The discomforts, indeed, were as nothing for importance compared candidly with the importance of the rest of the impression. The process certainly, however, one qualified, it had been interrupted by one of the most positive passages of one's life which may not figure here, alas. Unfortunately, as of the essence of my journey, vast brackets applied, as it were, to the very face of nature enclosed and rounded this felicity, which was no more of the texture of the general Southern stuff than a patch of old brocade would be of the woof of the native homespun. I had by deviation spent a week in a castle of enchantment. But if this modern miracle, of which the mountains of North Carolina happened to be, the scene would have been almost anywhere miraculous, I could at least take it as testifying all relevantly, all directly, for the presence as distinguished from the absence of feature. One felt how in this light the extent and the splendor of such a place was but a detail. These things were accidents, without which the great effect, the element that in the beautiful empty air made all the difference, would still have prevailed. What was this element but just the affirmation of resource, made with great emphasis, indeed, but in a clear and exemplary way, so that if large wealth represented some of them, an idea, a fine cluster of ideas, a purpose, a patience, an intelligence, a store of knowledge, immediately workable things represented the others. What it thus came to on behalf of this vast parenthetic 397 Carolinian demonstration was that somebody had cared enough, and that happily there had been somebody to care, which struck me at once as marking the difference for the rest of the text. My view of the melancholy of it had been conveniently expressed from hour to hour by the fond reflection through the dreary land that nobody cared really for it, or for anything that fairly made it dreary, as the crazy timber viaducts, where the train crawled and sometimes nervously stopped, spanned the deep gorges and the admirable nameless and more or less torrential streams, as the sense of landscape in mere quantity became once more the vehicle of effect. And as we pulled up at the small stations where the social scene might be sufficiently penetrated, no doubt, from the car window, the social scene shabby and sordid, and lost in the scale of space, as the quotable line is lost in a dull epic, or the needed name in an aging memory, would have been as interesting probably as a short story in one of the slangy dialects promoted by the illustrated monthly magazines. But it affected me above all, and almost each time I seemed to remember as speaking of the number of things not cared for. There were some, presumably though not at all discernibly, that were enough to beget the loose human cohesion, the scant consistency of parts and pieces, to which the array by the railway platform testified. But questions came up, plentifully in respect to the whole picture, and if the mass of interests that were absent was so remarkably large, this would be certainly because such interests were ruled out the grimness, with which, as by a hard inexorable fate, so many things were ruled out, fixed itself most perhaps as the impression of the spectator enjoying from his supreme seat of ease, his extraordinary, his awful modern privilege of this detached, yet concentrated stare at the misery of subject populations. Subject, I mean to this 398 superiority of his bought convenience a subject, even as never of old to the sway of satraps or proconsuls if the subject. Populations on the road to Charleston, seemingly weak indeed in numbers, and in energy, had to be viewed at all events so vividly, as not caring one made out quite with eagerness, that it was because they naturally couldn't the Negroes were more numerous than the whites, but still, there were whites off aspect so forlorn and depressed for the most part as to deprecate though not cynically only quite tragically, any imputation of value. It was a monstrous thing doubtless to sit there in a cushioned and kitchen Pullman and deny to so many groups of one's fellow creatures any claim to a personality, but this was in truth what one was perpetually doing. The Negroes, though superficially and doubtless not at all intendingly sinister, were the lustier race. But how could they care to insist on my point for such equivocal embodiments of the right complexion? Yet these were practically within the picture, the only affirmations of life except themselves, and they notoriously didn't care for themselves, the moral of all of which was that really through the more and more southward hours the wondering stops, and the blank renewals, it was only the restless analyst himself who cared enough after all he finally felt to make up for other deficiencies. He cared even when in the watches of the night he was roused under the bewilderment that was rarely to leave him in America at any stage of any transaction, to which the cars and their sparse stern functionaries formed a party for unpremeditated transfer to a dark and friendless void wherewith what grace he awaited the February dawn. The general American theory is that railway travel within the confines of the Republic is a matter of majestic simplicity, and facility qualified at the worst by inordinate luxury. I should 399 need, therefore an excursion here forbidden me to present another and perhaps a too highly subjective view of it. There are lights in which the majesty, if the question be of that, may strike the freshly repatriated, or in other words, the unwarned and inexpert, as quite grimly formidable lights. However, that must be left to shine for us in some other connection. Let it none the less glimmer out of them, for the moment that this implication of the penalty of imperfect expertness is really a clue to the essence of the matter, a core packed in relation to the whole subject of expertness, with fruitful suggestion. No single admonition in the States, I think, is more constant and vivid than the general mass of intimation of what may happen to you in transit. Unless you have had special and confirmed practice, you may have been without it in Europe for moving about, and yet not perish. But to be an expert in the American battle would be, it struck me, much more quickly to go down. Your luggage in America is looked after, but you are not saved so far as you receive on occasion a sharp order, or a sharper shove, by sufferance of which discipline, moreover, you by no means always purchase a prompt delivery of your effects. This, indeed, is but a translation of the general truth that it is the country in the world in which you must do most things for yourself. It may be better for you to have thus to do for yourself the secondary, as well as the primary things, but that is not here the question. It begins to strike you at all events, as soon as you begin to circulate, that your fellow travelers are for the most part as to the complex act itself professional, whereas you may perform it all in Europe, successfully enough as an amateur. Whether to your glory or your shame, you must of course yourself decide. But impunity, nay more success, may at least attend your empiricism. If it was not success, however, for the strayed amateur 400 to have found himself stranded in the small hours of morning, by the vast vague wayside, he still nevertheless remembers how quickly even this interlude took on an interest. The gloom was scarce penetrable, but a light glimmered here and there, and formless sheds and shanties, dim discomfortable things, straggled about, and lost themselves. Indistinguishable engines hooted before and behind where red fires also flared, and vanished indistinguishable too from each other, while one sought a place of temporary deposit for the impedimenta that attested one's absurd want of rehearsal, were the cold steel of the rails, the vague composition of the platform, And the kinder, the safer breast of earth, the place was apparently a junction, and it was but a question of waiting off, selecting as the wisest course among the hoots, and the flares to stand huddled, just where one was that almost completely unservanted state, which is so the mark in general of the American station, was here the sole distinctness I had succeeded in artlessly becoming a perfectly isolated traveler, with nobody to warn or comfort me, with nobody even to command. But it was precisely in this situation that I felt again, as by the click of a spring, that my adventure had, in spite of everything, or perhaps indeed, just because of everything, a charm, all its own, and a charm moreover, which I was to have from that moment for any connection no difficulty whatever in recognizing. It must have broken out more particularly then and there, in the breath of the night, which was verily now the bland air of the Southmold, benignant, a benediction in itself, as it hung about me, and with that blessed quality in it of its appearing a medium through which almost any good might come. It was the air of the open gates, not like that of the north of the closed, and one inhaled it, in short, on the spot, as the very boon of one's quest. A couple of hours later, in the right train, which had at last arrived, I had so settled to submission to this spell that it had wrought for me, I think, all its magic, ministered absolutely to the maximum of suggestion, which became thus, for my introduction to Charleston, the presiding influence. What had happened may doubtless show for no great matter in a bare verbal statement, yet it was to make all the difference I felt for impressions happy and harsh alike still to come. It couldn't have happened without one's beginning to wander, but the lively interest was that the further one wandered, the more the suggestions spoke the sense of the size of the margin. That was the name of it, the margin, by which the total of American life, huge as it already appears, is still so surrounded as to represent for the mind's eye, on a general view, but a scant central flotilla, huddled as for very fear of the fathomless depth of water, the too formidable future on the so much vaster lake of the materially possible. Once that torch is at all vividly lighted, it flares for any pair of open eyes over every scene, and with a presence that helps to explain their owner's inevitable failure to conclude. He feels it in all his uncertainties, and he never just escapes concluding without the sense that this so fallacious neatness would more or less absurdly have neglected or sacrificed it. Not by any means that the margin always affects him as standing for the vision of a possible greater good than what he sees in the given caseiny, more than as standing for a possible greater evil. These differences are submerged in the immense fluidity. They lurk confused, disengaged, in the mere looming mass of the more, and more to come, and as yet nothing makes definite the probable preponderance of particular forms of the more. The one all-positive appearance is of the perpetual increase of everything, the growth of the immeasurable muchness that shall constitute the deep sea 402, into which the seeker for conclusions must cast his nets. The fact that with so many things present, so few of them are not on the way to become quite other, and possibly altogether different things, conduces to the peculiar interest, and one often feels tempted to add to the peculiar irritation of the country. Roman 2. Charleston, early in the morning on my driving from the station, was, it had to be admitted, no very finished picture, but at least already it was different, ever so different in aspect and feeling, and above all for intimation and suggestion, from any passage of the American scene as yet deciphered, and such became on the spot one's appetite for local color, that one was fairly grateful to a friend who, by having promised to arrive from the interior of the state the night before, gave one a pretext for seeking him up and down. My quest for the moment proved vain, but the intimations and suggestions, while I proceeded from door to door in the sweet blank freshness of the day, of the climate of the streets, began to swarm at such a rate that I had the sense of gathering my harvest with almost too eager a thrift. It was like standing steeped at the bookstall itself in the volume picked up and opened. Though I may add that, when I had presently retreated upon the hotel to which I should in the first instance have addressed myself, it was quite for a turning of pages, as if I had gone on with the set thus before breakfast. I entered upon my brief residence with the right vibrations already determined, and unable really to say which of a couple of contacts just enjoyed would have most ministered to them. I had roused guilelessly, through an easy misunderstanding, 2 more or less sleeping 403 households, but if I had still missed my clue to my friend, I had yet put myself into possession of much of whatever else I had wanted. What had I most wanted, I could easily ask myself, but some small inkling, a mere specimen scrap, would do of the sense, as I have to keep forever calling my wanton synthesis of the South before the Warren air bubble, only to be blown in any case through some odd fragment of a pipe. My pair of early Charleston impressions, were thus a pair of thin prismatic bubble switch could have floated before me moreover, but for a few seconds collapsing even while I stood there. Prismatically nonetheless they had shown me the Old South in one case, by the mere magic of the manner, in which a small scared starved person of color of very light color, an elderly muletress in an improvised wrapper, just barely held open for me a door through which I felt I might have looked straight and far back into the past, that of the vanished order was hanging on there behind her as much of it as the scant place would accommodate, and she knew this, and that I had so quickly guessed it, which led her in fine before I could see more, and that I might not sound the secret of shy misfortune of faded pretension to shut the door in my face. So it seemed to me, had I been confronted in Italy under quite such a morning air, and light quite the same touch of a tepid odorous medium, with the ancient sallow crones, who guard the locked portals, and the fallen pride of provincial Palazzini, that was all in the one instance. There had been no more of it than of the little flare of a struck match which lasted long enough, however, to light the sedative cigarette smoked and thrown away, that renews itself forever between the picturesque's lips. The small historic whiff I had momentarily inhaled required the correction, I should add, of the sweeter breath of my commentary fresh altogether, was the air behind the garden wall, that next 404 gave way to my pursuit, there being a thrill, for that matter, in the fact that here at last again, if nowhere else over the land, rose the real walls that alone make real gardens, and that admit to the same by real doors. Close such a door behind you, and you are at once within a local relation, a possibility of retreat in favor of which the custom of the North has so completely ceased to discriminate. One sacrifice the North, with its mere hard conceit of virtuously meeting exhibition much, as if a house were just a metallic machine, number so-and-so, in a catalogon, sacrificed it on the spot to this finer feeling for the enclosure. That had really sufficed, no doubt, for my second initiation, since I remember withdrawing after my fruitless question, as on the completion of a mystic process initiation, into what I perhaps couldn't have said, only at the most into the knowledge that what such southern walls generally shut in proves exactly what one would have wished I was to see this loose quantity afterwards in greater profusion. But for the moment the effect was as right as that of privacy for the habit of the siesta. The details escape me, or rather, I tenderly withhold them for the siesta. There, what would it have been most like but some deep doze, or call it frankly some final sleep of the idea of success? And how could one better have described the privacy with the mild street shut off, and with the deep gallery where resignation might sit in the shade, or swing without motion in a hammock, shut in, than as some dim dream that things were still, as they had been still pleasant behind garden walls before the great folly I was to find myself liking in the South, and in the most monstrous fashion it appeared those aspects, in which the consequences of the great folly were for extent and gravity still traceable, I was cold-bloodedly to prefer them, that is, to the aspects occasionally to be met from which the traces had been removed, and 405 this, I need hardly say, from a point of view having so little in common with the vindictive, as to be quite directly opposed to it, for what in the world was one candidly to do? It is the manner of the purged and renovated the disconnected element anywhere after great trials to express itself in forms comparatively vulgar, whereas those parts of the organism that, having been through the fire, still have kept the scorches and scars, resemble for tone, for color, and value the products of the potter's oven when the potter, I mean, or when, in other words, history has been the right great artist, they at least are not cheerful Ronasesthi, have been baked beautiful and I even tried, I fear, when once installed there, to look at my hotel in that light, availing myself to this end of its appearance of dating with its fine old neoclassic front, and of a certain romantic grandeur of scale, the scale positively of Latin construction in my vast saloon-like apartment, which opened to a high colonnade. The great canopied and curtained bed was really in the grand manner, and the ghost of a Rococo tradition, the tradition of the transatlantic South memory of other lands, glimmered generally in the decoration, when once I had, though almost exclusively under the charm of these particular faded graces, I admit again, privately protested, that the place might have been a palace. My peace was made. With Charleston, I was ripe for the last platitude of appreciation. Let me say, indeed, that this consciousness had from the first to struggle with another, the immediate sense of the degree in which the American scene is lighted on occasion to the critical eye by the testimony of the hotel, as had been the case for me already at Richmond, so here again. The note of that truth was sounded. The visitor interested in manners was too clearly not to escape it, and I scarce know under what slightly sinister warning he braced himself to the fact. 406. He had not as yet for repatriation been thrown much upon the hotel, but this was the high sense of looking further, and seeing more this present promise of that adventure one is thrown upon it in America, as straight upon the general painted scene over which the footlights of publicity play with their large crudity, and against the freela-brush texture and grain, of which you thus rub your nose more directly, and with less of ceremony than elsewhere. There are endless things in Europe to your vision behind and beyond the hotel. A multitudinous complicated life in the States on the other hand, you see the hotel as itself that life as constituting for vast numbers of people, the richest form of existence. You have to go no distance, for this to come over utwenty appearances, so vividly speak of it is not so much no doubt, that everyone lives at hotels according to the witless belief of Europe, but that you so quickly seem to measure the very limited extent to which those who people them, the populations they appeal to in general, may be conceived as living out of them. I remember how often in moving about the observation that most remained with me appeared to be this note of the hotel, and of the hotel-like chain of Pullman cars, as the supreme social expression for the Pullmans too in their way, were eloquent. They affected me ever by the end of 24 hours, as carrying if not Caesar and his fortune at least almost all the facts of American life. There were some of course that didn't fit into them, but so many others did, and these fitted somehow so perfectly, and with such a congruity. What it comes back to is that in such conditions the elements of the situation show with all possible though quite unnoted intensity. They tell you all about it, about the situation, in a few remarkably plain and distinct words. They make you feel in short how its significance is written upon it. It is as if the figures before you and 407, all round you less different from each other, less different too, I think, from the objects about them, whatever these in any case may be, than any equal mass of appearances under this unit, is as if every one and everything said to you straight, yes, this is how we are, this is what it is to enjoy our advantages, this moreover is all there is of us. We give it all out, make what you can of it. The restless analyst would have had indeed an unusual fit of languor, if he had not begun from the first to make of it what he could divide it, even though he was between his sense of this largelierant significance, and his wonderment none the less as to its value and bearing, which constituted after all a shade of perplexity. As to its meaning, yes, I see how you are. God Nosh was ready, with his reply, for nothing in the world is easier to see even in all the particulars. But what does it mean to be, as you err, since I suppose it means something more than your mere one universal type with its small deflections, but never a departure, something more than your way of sitting in silence together at table, than your extraordinary, your enormous passivity, than your apparent absence of criticism or judgment of anything that is put before you, or that happens to you, beyond occasionally remarking that it's fine, that in a word the fact of what you eat, and the fact of how you eat it, you are not final, complacently as you appear so much of the time, to assume idier mere inevitable shaking about in the margin, must more or less take care of that, since you can't be so inordinately passive everywhere one infers, but in your particular wary niche of your business block, without being in some degree plastic distinct, as you are not even definite. And it would be terrible not to be able to suppose that you are as yet but an installment, a current number like that of the morning paper, a specimen of a type, in course of serialization like 408, the hero of the magazine novel, by the highly successful author, the climax of which is still far off. Thus, as you are perpetually provisional, the hotels and the Pullmans that are like rushing hotels, and the hotels that are like stationary Pullmans, represent the stages and forms of your evolution, and are not a bit in themselves more final than you are. The particulars still to be added either to you or to them form an insoluble question, and meanwhile clearly your actual stage will not be short, so much as that I recall had hummed about my ears at Richmond, where the strong vertical light of a fine domed and glazed courtile, the spacious and agreeable dining hall of the inn, had rested on the human scene, as with an effect of mechanical pressure. If the scene constituted evidence, the evidence might have been in course of being pressed out in this shining form, by the application of a weight, and the turn of a screw. There it was accordingly. There was the social, the readable page, with its more or less complete report of the conditions. The report was to be fuller as to some of these at Charleston, but I had at least grasped its general value, and I shall come back to the Charleston report. It would have been a sorry business here, however, if this had been mainly the source of my impressions, which was so far from the case that I had but to go forth after breakfast, to find insidious charm, the appeal of the outer, the larger aspect await me at every turn. The day announced itself as warm and radiant, and keeping its promise to the end squared itself there as the golden frame of an interesting picture interesting above all from the moment one desired with any intensity to find it. So the vision persists with its charming touching features. Yet, when I look back and ask myself, what can have made my impression all round so positive, I am at a loss for elements to refer it to. Elements 409. There were certainly in especial the fact that during these first bland hours charged with the splendor of spring, I caught the wittied smile of the South, that expression of a temperamental felicity, in which shades of character questions of real feature other marks and meanings tend always to lose themselves. But a deficiency was clear which was neither more nor less than the deficiency of life without life, all gracefully. The picture managed to compose itself, even while one felt it, do so one missed the precious presence, so that there at least was food for wonderment, for admiration of the art at play. To what all the while as one went could one compare the mystification to? What if not to the image of some handsome pale person a beauty to call her so of other days, who besides confessing to the inanimate state from closed eyes and motionless lips, from the arrest of respiration and gesture, was to leave one by the day's end, with the sense of a figure, prepared for romantic interment, stretched in a fair winding sheet, covered with admirable flowers, surrounded with shining tapers, that one reasoned would be something to have seen, and yet one's interest was not so limited. Ruins to be interesting have to be massive, and poor bittersweet Charleston suffered for the observer by the merciless law of the thinness, making too much for transparency for the effect of paucity still inherent in American groupings, a law under which the attempt to subject them to portraiture to see them as composing resembles the attempt to play whist with an imperfect pack of cards. If one had already at the North divined the general complexion as probably thin in this sense, everywhere thin, that is for all note-taking, but the statistical under which it might of course show as portentously thick, it wouldn't turn dense or rich of a sudden even in an air that could so drench it with benignity. Therefore, if the scene, as one might say, was 410, but the historic desert, without the historic mausoleum, how was one's impression to give out, as it clearly would the aftertaste of experience? To let this small problem worry me no longer than it might, I sought an answer, and quickly found one in the fortunate fact of my not having failed, after all of the admirably suggestive society of my distinguished and competent friend. He had arrived overnight according to my hope, and had only happened to lodge himself momentarily out of my ken, so that as soon as I had his company to profit by, I felt the analytic burden of my own blessedly lifted. I took over his analysis, infinitely better adjusted to the case, and which clearly would suffice for everything if only it should itself escape disintegration. Let me say at once that it quite averted, whether consciously or unconsciously, whether as too formidably bristling or as too perfectly pacific, that menace, which success was to provide for us, both I think a rounded felicity, my companion a northerner of southern descent, as well as still more immediately on another side of English, knew his South in general, and his Carolina of that ilk, in particular, with an intimacy that was like a grab-bag, into which, for illustration, he might always dip his hand, a movement that, had the grab-bag been European, I should describe rather as a plunge of his arm, so that it comes back again to the shallowness of the American grab-bag. As yet, for illustrations other than the statistical, he held up for me his bright critical candle, which even in the intrinsic Charleston vividness made its gay flicker, and it was under this aid that, to my extreme convenience, I was able to feel the place. My fortune had indeed an odd sequel, which I mention for its appreciatory value, the mishaps and accidents of appreciation being ever in their way, I think, as contributive to judgment as the felicities I was to challenge too recklessly. The chances 411 of a second day having by the end of the first, and by the taking of example, quite learned to treat the scene as a grab-bag for my own hand, I went over it again, in an evil hour, whereupon I met afresh the admonition, already repeatedly received, that, where in the States the interest, where the pleasure of contemplation is concerned, discretion is the better part of valor and insistence. Too often a betrayal, it is not so much that the hostile fact crops up, as that the friendly fact breaks down. If you have luckily seen, you have seen, carry off your prize in this case instantly, and at any risk try it again, and you won't see, for there is in all contemplation, there is even in any clear appreciation, an element of the cruel. These things demand that your exposed object shall first of all exist, and to exist for exposure is to be at the best impaled on the naturalist's pin. It takes superpositions at any rate to defy sufficiently This sort of attention it takes, either the stoutnesses of history or the rarest rarities of nature, to resist fatal penetration, that was to come home to me presently in Florida through the touched sense of the truth that Florida ever so amiably is weak. You may live there serenely, no doubtas, in a void, furnished at the most with velvet air. You may in fact live there with an idea if you are content that your idea shall consist of grapefruit and oranges, grapefruit and velvet air, constitute in a manner I admit a feast, but press upon the board with any greater weight, and it quite gives way its 3 or 4 props treacherously forsake it. That is what I mean by the impression in the great empty peninsula of weakness, which I was to feel still clearer about, on being able to compare it afterwards with the impression of California, was to have if I may decently be premature about either own treachery, but she was to wind one up much higher before she let one down. I was to find her 412, especially at the first flush, unlike sweet frustrated Florida, ever so amiably strong, which came from the art with which she makes the stoutnesses, as I have called them of natural beauty, stand you in temporary stead of the leannesses of everything else, everything that might be of an order equally interesting. This she is on a short acquaintance, quite insolently able to do thanks to her belonging so completely to the handsome side of the continent, of which she is the finest expression. The aspect of natural objects up and down the Pacific coast is as aristocratic as the comprehensive American condition permits anything to be. It, indeed, appears to the ingenious mind to represent an instinct on the part of nature, a sort of shuddering bristling need to brace herself in advance against the assault of a society so much less marked with distinction than herself. If I was to conceive, therefore, under these later lights, that her spirit had put forth nowhere on the subtropical Atlantic shore anything to approach this conscious pride, so doubtless the Carolinian effect, even at its sweetest, was to strike me as related to it very much as a tinkle is related to a boom. Roman 3. To stray but for an instant into such an out-of-the-way corner of one's notes, however, is to give the lie to the tenderness that asserted itself so promptly as the very medium of one's perception. There was literally no single object that from morn to nightfall it was not more possible to consider with tenderness, a rich consistency of tenderness, than to consider without it. Such was the subtle trick that Charleston could still play. There echoed for me as I looked out from the battery the recent speech of a friend, which had had at the time 413 depressing weight, the battery of the long curved seafront of the waterside public garden, furnished with sad old historic guns, with live oaks draped in trailing moss with palmettos, that as if still mindful of their state symbolism, seemed to try everywhere, though with a melancholy skeptical droop, to repeat the old escutcheon, with its large thrilling view, in particular thrilling to a northerner, who stands there for the first time, filled as I am in general. While there my friend had said, with the sadness and sorrow of the South, I never at Charleston look out to the old betrayed forts, without feeling my heart harden again. To steal, one remembered that on the spot, and one waited a little to see what was happening to one's heart. I found this to take time. Indeed, everything differed somehow from one's old conceived imager. If I had anciently grasped the remoteness of Fort Sumter near the mouth of the bay, and of its companion at the point of the shore forming the other side of the passage, this lucidity had so left me in the course of the years, that the faraway dimness of the consecrated objects was almost a shock. It was a blow even to one's faded vision of Charleston, viciously firing on the flag. The flag would have been from the battery such a mere speck in space that the vice of the act lost somehow with the distance, to say nothing of the 40 years, a part of its grossness. The smitten face, however flushed and scarred, was out of sight, though the intention of smiting and the force of the insult were, of course, still the same. This reflection one made, but the old fancied perspective and proportions were altered, and then the whole picture at that hour exhaled an innocence. It was as blank as the face of a child under mention of his naughtiness, and his punishment of week before last. The forts faintly blue on the twinkling sea looked like vague marine flowers. Innocence, pleasantness ruled the prospect. It was as if 414, the compromised slate sponged clean of all the wicked words, and hung up on the wall for better use, dangled there so vacantly as almost to look foolish. Ah, there again was the word. The air still just tasted of the antique folly, so that in presence of a lesson so sharp and so prolonged of the general sterilized state of the brightly lighted delicate dreariness, recording the folly harshness, was conjured away. There was that in the impression which affected me after a little, as one of those refinements of irony that wait on deep expiations. One could scarce conceive at this time of day that such a place had ever been dangerously moved, it was the bled condition, and mostly the depleted cerebral condition that was thus attested as. I had recognized it at Richmond, and I asked myself on the Battery what more one's sternest justice could have desired if my heart wasn't to harden to steel in short access to it, by the right influence, had found perhaps too many other forms of sensibility in ambush. To justify hardness, moreover, one would have had to meet something hard, and if my peregrination after this had been a search for such an element, I should have to describe it as made all in vain. Up and down and in and out with my companion, I strolled from hour to hour, but more and more under the impression of the consistency of softness. One could have expressed the softness in a word, and the picture so offered would be infinitely touching. It was a city of gardens, and absolutely of no manner of so few that save for the general sweetness, the war might still have been raging, and all the manhood at the front. The gardens were matter for the women, though even of the women there were few, and that small company rare discreet flitting figures that brushed the garden walls with noiseless skirts in the little melancholy streets of interspaced overtangled abodes were clad in a rigor of mourning that was like the garb of a conspiracy. The effect was superficially prim, but so far as it savored of malice prepense of the southern, the sentimental partiprice, it was delightful. What was it? Almost like the incoherent jumble of suggestion of a social shrinkage and an economic blight, unrepaired, irreparable, the suggestion of byways of some odd, Far East infected with triumphant women's, writes some perspective of builded plastered lanes over the enclosures of which the flowering almond drops its petals into sharp deep bands of shade, or of sun. It is not the muffled ladies who walk about predominantly in the East. But that is a detail. The likeness was perhaps greater to some little old-world quarter of quiet convents, where only priests and nuns steal forth, the priests mistakable at a distance say for the nuns. It was indeed thoroughly mystifying, the whole picturescence I was to get in the freshness of that morning, from the very background of the scene, my quite triumphant little impression of the Old South. I remember feeling with intensity at 2 or 3 points, in particular that I should never get a better one, that even this was precarious, might melt at any moment, by a wrong touch, or a false note in my graspend, that I must therefore make the most of it. The rest of my time, I may profess, was spent in so doing. I made the most of it in several successive spots, under the south wall of St. Michael's Church, the sweetest corner of Charleston, and of which there is more to say, out in the old cemetery on the edge of the lagoon, where the distillation of the past was perhaps clearest, and the bribe to tenderness most effective, and even not a little on ground thereunto almost adjacent that of a kindly country club installed in a fine old semi-sinister mansion, and holding an afternoon revel at which I was privileged briefly to assist. The wrong touch and the false note were 416, doubtless just sensible in this last connection, where the question probed a little would apparently have been of some New South that has not yet quite found the effective way romantically, or at least insidiously, to appeal. The South that is cultivating country clubs is a South presumably in many connections quite in the right, whereas the one we were invidiously after was the one that had been so utterly in the wrong, even there none the less in presence of more than a single marked sign of the rude northern contagion. I disengaged, socially speaking, a faint residuum, which I mention for proof of the intensity of my quest, and of my appreciation. There were 2 other places, I may add, where one could but work the impression for all it was in the modern phrase worth, and where I had, I may venture to say, the sense of making as much of it as was likely ever to be made again. Meanings without end were to be read under tuition into one of these, which was neither more nor less than a slightly shy, yet after all quite serene place of refection, a luncheon-room or tea-house, denominated for quaint reasons, an exchange, very exchange, in fact lately commemorated in a penetrating study, already much known to fame of the little that is left of the local society. My tuition, at the hands of my ingenious comrade, was the very best it was possible to have. Nothing usually is more wonderful than the quantity of significant character that, with such an example, set the imagination may recognize in the scantest group of features. Objects persons I fantastically feasted here at my luncheon table, not only as the genius of the place demanded on hot chocolate sandwiches and Lady Baltimore cake, this last a most delectable compound, but on the exact nuance of oddity, of bravery, of reduced gentility, of irreducible superiority, to which the opening of such an establishment without derogation by the proud daughters of 417 war-wasted families could exquisitely testify. They hovered, the proud impoverished daughters, singly, or in couples behind the counter again, Delectably charged they waited inscrutably, irreproachably, yet with all that peculiarly chaste bonhomie of the southern tone on the customers, once even coming to ascertain these at the little thrifty tables. And if the drama and its adjusted theater really contained all the elements of history, tragedy, comedy, irony, that a pair of expert romancers closely associated for the hour were eager to evoke the scene, would have been, I can only say, supreme of its kind, that desire of the artist to linger where the breath of a subject, faintly stirring, the air reaches his vigilant sense would here stay my stepses. This very influence was in fact to his great good fortune, to stay those of my companion. The charm I speak of, the charm to cherish, however, was most exhaled for me in other conditions that scarce permit of any direct reference to their full suggestiveness. If I alluded above to the vivid Charleston background where its mystification most scenically persists, the image is all rounded and complete for memory in this connection at Witches. The case is of an admirably mature and preserved interior. I can only glance as I pass the puzzlement elsewhere, is in the sense that though the elements of earth and air, the color, the tone, the light, the sweetness in fine linger on the Old South, could have had no such unmitigated mildness, could never have seen itself as subject to such strange feminization. The feminization is there just to promote for us some eloquent antithesis, just to make us say that whereas the ancient order was masculine fierce, and mustachioed, the present is at the most a sort of sick lioness, who has so visibly parted with her teeth and claws that we may patronizingly walk all round her. This image really gives us the best word for the 418 general effect of Charleston, that of the practically vacant cage, which used in the other time to emit sounds, even to those of the portentous shaking of bars, audible as far away as in the listening north. It is the vacancy that is a thing by itself, a thing that makes us endlessly wonder how in and at all complex a great political society can everything so have gone, assuming indeed that under this aegis very much ever had come. How can everything so have gone that the only Southern book of any distinction published for many a year is The Souls of Black Folk, by that most accomplished of members of the Negro race, Mr. W.E.B. Du Bois, had the only focus of life then been slavery from the point onward that slavery had reached a quarter of a century before the war, so that with the extinction of that interest, none other of any sort was left to say yes, seems the only way to account for the degree of the vacancy. And yet even as I form that word, I meet as a reproach the face of the beautiful old house I just mentioned, whose ample spaces had so unmistakably echoed to the higher amenities that one seemed to feel the accumulated traces and tokens gradually come out of their corners like blessed objects, taken one by one from a reliquary worn, with much handling, the note of such haunted chambers, as the haunted structurally above all quite, as by the ghost of the grand Styluas, not certainly, a thinness of reverberation, so that I had to take refuge here, in the fact that everything appeared thoroughly to antedate, to refer itself to the larger, the less vitiated past that had closed a quarter of a century, or so before the war, before the fatal time, when the South monomaniacal at the parting of the ways elected for extension and conquest, the admirable old house of the stately hall and staircase of the charming coved and vaulted drawing-room of the precious mahogany doors, the tall, unsophisticated portraits, the delicate dignity of 419 welcome, owed nothing of its noble identity, nothing at all appreciable to the monomania, however, that might be. Moreover, I kept finding the mere melancholy charm reassert itself, where it could, the charm, I mean, of the flower-crowned waist, that was by my measure what the monomania had most prepared itself to bequeath in the old cemetery, by the lagoon, to which I have already alluded. This influence distills an irresistible poetry, as one has courage to say, even in remembering how disproportionately almost anywhere on the American scene the general place of interment is apt to be invited to testify for the presence of charm. The golden afternoon, the low silvery seaward horizon, as of wide sleepy game-haunted inlets, and reed-smothered banks, possible sight of some Venice that had never mustered the luxury in the mild air of shrub and plant and blossom that the pale north can but distantly envy, something that I scarce know how to express, but as the proud humility of the whole idle easy loveliness made even the restless analyst for the hour among the pious inscriptions that scarce ever belie the magniloquent clime, or the inimitable tradition, feel himself really capable of the highest Carolinian pitch. To what height did he rise, on the other hand, on being introduced another day at no great distance from this point, and where the silvery seaward outlook still prevails to the lapsed and reed-ministered residents, also already named, that was to give him his one glimpse of any local modernism. This was the nearest approach for him to any reanimation of the flower-crowned waste, and he has still in memory for symbol of the modernism, a vision of the great living blazing fire of logs, round which as the afternoon had turned wet, and chill this contribution to his view of a possible new society, a possible youthful tone, a possible southern future in short had disposed itself. There were men here in the 420 picturea few, and young ones, that odd other sense as of a becraped feminized world, was accordingly for the moment in abeyance, for the moment, I say advisedly for the moment only, since what aspect of the social scene anywhere in the States strikes any second glance as exempt from that condition, it is overwhelmingly feminized, or it is not. That is the formula with which its claim to existence pierces the ear, lest, however, the recognition again of this truth should lead me too far. I content myself with noting a matter perhaps more relevant, just Huron's inevitable consciousness, in presence of the new manifestations, that the South is in the predicament of having to be tragic, as it were in order to beguile. It was very hard, I said to myself, and very cruel and very perverse, and above all very strange. But what use had the restless analyst here for a lively and oblivious type? Was there not something in the lively and oblivious that, given the materials employed for it, and the effect produced by it, threw one back with renewed relish on the unforgetting and the devoted, on the resentful, and even if need might be the vindictive? These things would represent certainly a bad etat d'amende. Was one thus cold-bloodedly critically to wish such a condition perpetuated? The answer to that seemed to be monstrously enough. Well, yes, for these people, since it appears the only way by which they can be interesting, see, when they try other ways, their sadness and sorrow, as my friend called it, has at least for it that it has been expensively produced. Everything else, on the other hand, anything that may pretend to be better so cheaply. One had already in moving about winced often enough at sight of where one was intellectually to land under these last consistencies of observation and reflection. So I may put it here that I didn't after all land, but recoiled rather and forbore, making my skiff 421 fast to no conclusion, whatever, only pushing out again, and letting it for a supreme impression, and to prepare in the aftertime the best remembrance drift, where it would so accordingly, the aftertime having a little arrived, it touches now once more of its own motion, carries me back, and puts me ashore on the one spot where the impression had been perfectly felicitous. I have already named the place under the mild, the bright south wall of St. Michael's Church, where the whole precinct offered the full-blown southern spring that morning. The finest of all canvases to embroider the canvas here, yes, was of the best. Not only did Charleston show me none other so good, but I was doubtless to have met south or north none of an equal happy grain and form. The high, complicated, inflated spire of the church has the sincerity approved of time that is so rare over the land in the work of man's hands, laden though these be with the millions he offers as a vain bribe to it. And in the sweet old churchyard ancient authority seemed to me on the occasion of my visit to sit among the sun-warmed tombs and the interlated slabs and the extravagant flowers, as on the sole cushion the general American bareness in such connections had left it. There was more still of association and impression I found under this charm, I confess, character, in every feature, even in the much-maintained interior revolutions and renovations, have respected its sturdy, rather somber essence. The place feels itself in the fine old dusky archaic way the constituted temple of a faith achieves, in a word, the air of reality that one had seen in every other such case from town to town, and from village to village, missed with an unconsciousness that had to do duty for success. Roman 14. Florida. It is the penalty of the state of receiving too many impressions of too many things, that when the question arises of giving some account of these, a small sharp anguish attends the act of selection, and the necessity of omission. They have so hung together, have so almost equally contributed for the fond critic to the total image, the chapter of experience, whatever such may have been, that to detach and reject is like mutilation or falsification, the history of any given impression, reciting often largely in others that have led to it, or accompanied it. This I find the case again and again with my American memories. There was something of 100 of those I may not note in each of those I may, and I feel myself amid the swarm pluck but a fruit or two from any branch. When I think of Florida, for instance, I think of 20 matters involved in the start and the approach. I think of the moist, the slightly harsh Sunday morning under the portico of the Charleston Hotel. I think of the inauspicious drizzle about the yellow omnibus, archaic and provincial, that awaited the departing. Guests remembering how these antique vehicles, repudiated rickety stages of the age ignorant of trolleys, affected me here and there, as the quaintest, most immemorial of American things, the persistent use of which surely represented the very 423 superstition of the past. I think of the gentleman in the watchful knot, who while our luggage emerged was moved to say to me for some reason, "I guess we manage our traveling here better than in your country," whereby he so easily triumphed blank, as I had to remain as to the country he imputed to me. I think of the inimitable detachment with which at the very moment he spoke the Negro porter, engaged at the door of the conveyance put straight down into the mud of the road, the dressing bag I was obliged a few minutes later in our close-pressed company to nurse on my knees, and I go so far even as almost to lose myself in the sense of other occasions evoked by that reminiscence. This marked anomaly, the apparently deep-seated inaptitude of the Negro race at large for any alertness of personal service, having been throughout a lively surprise. One had counted with some eagerness in moving southward on the virtual oppositian, finding this deficiency, encountered right, and left at the north beautifully corrected. One had remembered the old Southern tradition, the house alive with the scramble of young darkies, for the honor of fetching and carrying, and one was to recognize no doubt at the worst its melancholy ghost. Its very ghost, however, by my impression had ceased to walk. Or if this be not the case, the old planters, the cotton gentry, were the people in the world the worst ministered to. I could have shed tears for them at moments, reflecting that it was for this they had fought and fallen. The Negro waiter at the hotel is in general, by an oddity of his disposition, so zealous to break for you 2 or 3 eggs into a tumbler, or to drop for you 3 or 4 lumps of sugar into a coffee cup, that he scarce waits in either case for your leave. But these struck me everywhere as the limit of his accomplishment. He lends himself sufficiently to the 424 rough, gregarious bustle of crowded feeding places, but seemed to fall below the occasion on any appeal to his individual promptitude, which reflections doubtless exactly illustrate my profession of a moment ago. As to the insidious continuity, the close interrelation of observed phenomena, I might with a little audacity insist still further on that which was in fact what I had originally quite promised myself to do. I certainly should have been half heartbroken at the hour itself, for example, had I then had to estimate as pure waste my state of sensibility to the style and stamp of my companions' aspects and sounds burned into my memory, as I find, but none the less overstraining I am obliged to feel the frame of these remarks so vivid on the spot, was the sense of these particular human and sectional appearances and of certain others of the same cluster, that they remained for me afterwards beautifully placed in this connection of the pilgrimage to Palm Beach. And not the less relevant for being incidental, I was to find the obvious bagman, the lusty drummer of the southern trains and inns, if there be not as yet unrevealed to me some later fond diminutive of designation for the ubiquitous commercial traveler. I was to find, I say, this personage promptly insist on a category of his own, a category which at the moments I here recall loomed so large as to threaten to block out of view almost every other object. Was I the victim of grave mischance? Was my infelicity exceptionaler? Was the type with which the scene so abounded? Were the specimens I was thus to treasure all of the common class, and the usual frequency I was to treasure them as specimens of something I had surely never yet so undisputedly encountered? They went all by themselves, as it were, so far were as to facial character, vocal tone, primal rawness of speech, general accent, and attitude extraordinarily base and vulgar. And 425, it was interesting to make out why this fact took on, for my edification, so unwonted an intensity. The fact of the influence on the whole man of a sordid and ravenous habit was naturally no new thing. One had met him enough about the world, the brawny peddler more or less gorged with the fruits of misrepresentation, and blatant and brazen in the key of his special line of goods, and the measure of his need. But if the figure was immemorial, why did it now usurp a value out of proportion to other values? What, for instance, were its remorseless reasons for treating the restless analyst at the breakfast there? Perhaps above all, to so lurid a vision of its triumph, he had positively come to associate the breakfast there from hotel to dining car, and from dining car to hotel, with the perfect security of this exhibition, the sight of the type in completely unchallenged possession. I scarce know why my sensibility at the juncture in question so utterly gave way to it, why I appealed in vain, from one of these so solemn life-eating presences to another they refused to the wondering mind, Any form of relief they insisted, as I say with the strange crudity of their air of commercial truculence, on being exactly as low as they liked, and the affirmation was made in the setting of the great greasy inelegant room, as quietly as possible, and without the least intention of offense. There were ladies and children all about, though indeed there may have been sometimes, but the lone breakfasting child to reckon, with the little pale carnivorous coffee-drinking ogre or ogress, who prowls down in advance of its elders, engages a table-dreed vision and has the run of the bill of fare. The great blank decency, at all events, was no more broken than on the general American scene. It ever is, yet the apprehension of marks and signs, the trick of speculation, declined none the less to drop. Whom were they constructed such specimens to talk with, to talk 426 over, or to talk under? And what form of address, or of intercourse, what uttered, what intelligible terms of introduction, of persuasion, of menace? What developed, what specific human process of any sort, was it possible to impute to them? What reciprocities did they imply? What presumptions could they create? What happened inconceivably, when such Greeks met such Greeks? Such faces looked into such faces, and such sounds in especial were exchanged with such sounds. What women did they live with? What women living with them could yet leave them, as they were? What wives, daughters, sisters did they in fine make credible? And what in especial was the speech, what the manners, what the general dietary, what most the monstrous morning meal of ladies receiving at such hands? The law, or the license of life? Questions, these latter, some of which all the while were not imperceptibly answered, save that the vainest, no doubt, was that baffled inquiry, as to the thinkable ground, amid such relations of preliminary confidence. What was preliminary confidence, where it had to reckon so with the minimum of any finished appearance? How, when people were like that, did anyone trust anyone enough to begin, or understand anyone enough to go on, or keep the peace with anyone enough to survive? Wasn't it, however, at last none the less the sign of a fallacy, somewhere in my impression, that the peace was kept precisely, while I so luxuriously wondered, the consciousness of which presently led me round to something that was at the least a temporary, a working answer? My friends, the drummers, bore me company, thus in the smoking car through the deepening sweetening south, where the rain soon gave way to a refinement of mildness, all the way to Savannah, at the end of which time, under the enchantment of the spreading scene, I had more or less issued from my maze. It was not probably that, inflated though they might 427 be, after early refreshment with the inward conflict of a greater number of strange sacrifices to appetite than I had ever before seen perpetrated at once, they were really more gruesome examples of a class at best disquieting than might elsewhere have been discovered. It was only that by so sad a law of their situation they were at once more exposed, and less susceptible of bearing exposure, they so became to my imagination, and by a mere turn of the hand of that precious faculty, something like victims and martyrs, creatures, touchingly tragically doomed, for they hadn't asked, when one reflected, to be almost the only figures in the social landscape, hadn't wanted the fierce light to beat all on themselves, they hadn't actively usurped the appearance of carrying on life, without aid of any sort from other kinds of persons, other types, presences, classes. If these others were absent, it wasn't their fault, and though they devoured at a matutinal sitting 30 little saucers of insane, of delirious food, this was yet a law which over much of the land appeared to recognize no difference of application for age, sex, condition, or constitution, and it had not in short been their pretension to take over the whole social case. It would have been so different, this case, and the general effect for the human scene would have been so different, with a due proportion of other presences, other figures and characters, members of other professions, representatives of other interests, exemplars of other possibilities in man, than the mere possibility of getting the better of his fellowman over a trade. Wondrous always to note is this sterility of aspect, and this blight of vulgarity, humanly speaking, where a single type has had the game, as one may say, all in its hands. Character is developed to visible fineness only by friction and discipline on a large scale, only by its having to reckon with a complexity of forces, a process which 428 results at the worst in a certain amount of social training. No kind of person that was the admonitionist a very good kind, and still less a very pleasing kind, when its education has not been made to some extent by contact with other kinds, by a sense of the existence of other kinds, and to that degree by a certain relation with them. This education may easily, at 100 points, transcend the teaching of the big brick schoolhouse, for all the latter's claim to universality. The last dose ever administered by the great wooden spoon So actively plied there is the precious, bittersweet of a sense of proportion, yet to miss that taste ever at the table of civilization, is to feel ourselves, seated surely too much below the salt we miss it, when the social effect of it fails when all so dismally, or so monstrously, every one strikes us as after but one thing, and as thus not only unaware of the absent importances and values, but condemned and restricted as a direct consequence of it, to the mere raw stage of their own particular connection. I so worked out in a word that what was the matter with my friends was not at all that they were viciously full-blown, as one might say, or the ultimate sort of monstrosity they had at first appeared, but that they were on the contrary, just unformed, undeveloped, unrelated above all unrelated to any merciful modifying terms of the great social proposition. They were not in their place, not relegated, shaded, embowered, protected, and dreadful, though this might be to a stray observer of the fact it was much more dreadful for themselves. They had the helpless weakness, and I think even somewhere in dim depths deeper down still, than the awful breakfast habit, the vaguely troubled sense of it, they would fall into their place at a touch. Were the social proposition, as I have called it, completed, they would then help quite subordinately assist the long sentence to 429, read relieved of their ridiculous charge, of supplying all its clauses. I positively at last thought of them, as appealing from this embarrassment, in which sublime patience I was floated, as I say to Savannah. Roman 2. After that it was plain sailing, in the sense I mean of the respite temporary, at least off speculation of feeling impressions file in, and seat themselves as quietly as decorous worshippers, say mild old ladies, with neat prayer books, taking possession of some long-drawn family pew. It was absurd what I made of Savannah, which consisted for me but of a quarter of an hour's pause of the train, under the wide arch of the station, where in the now quite confirmed blandness of the Sunday noon a bright brief morning party appeared of a sudden to have organized itself, where was the charm if it wasn't already supremely in the air, the latitude, the season, as well as in the imagination of the pilgrim, capable, not only of squeezing a sense from the important city on these easy terms, and with that desperate economy, but of reading, heaven knows what installment of romance into a mere railroad matter. It is a mere railroad matter in the States that a station should appear at a given moment to yield to the invasion of a dozen or so of bareheaded and vociferous young women in the company of young men to match, and that they should all treat the place in the public eye, that of the crowded contemplative cars, quite as familiar domestic intimate ground, set apart it, might be for the discussion and regulation of their little interests and affairs, and for that so oddly, so innocently immodest ventilation of their puerile privacies, at which the moralizing visitor so frequently gasps. I recall my fleeting instance of Savannah as the taste of a 430 cup charged to the brim. I recall the swarming, the hatless pretty girls with their big-bowed cues, their romping swains, their inveterate suggestion of their having more to say about American manners than any other single class. I recall the thrill produced by the hawkers of scented southern things, sprigs, and specimens of flower and fruit that mightn't as yet be of the last exoticism, but that were native and fresh and overpriced, and so all that the traveler could ask. But most of all I think I recall the quite lively resolve not to give way under the assault of the beribboned and shirt-waisted fair to the provocation of their suggestiveness of an, as I had fallen, reflectively speaking, straight into the trap set for me by the Charleston bagmen, a resolve taken, I blush to say, as a base economic precaution, only, and not because the spectacle before me failed to make reflections swarm. They fairly hummed my suppressed reflections in the manner of bees about a flower bed, and burying their noses as deep in the carl of the subject. Had I allowed myself time before the train resumed its direction, I should have thus found myself regarding the youths, and the maidens, but especially for many reasons, the maidens quite in the light of my so earnestly considered drummers, quite as creatures extraordinarily disconcerting at first as to the whole matter of their public behavior, but covered little by the mantle of charity, as soon as it became clear that what, like the poor drummers, they suffer from, is the tragedy of their social, their cruel exposure, that treachery of fate, which has kept them so out of their place. It was a case I more than ever saw like the case of the bagmen. The case of the bagmen lighted it here in the most interesting way by propinquity and coincidence. If the bagmen had seemed monstrous in their occupancy of the scene by their disproportioned possession of it, so was not the 431 hint sufficient that this also explains much of the effect of the American girl, as encountered in the great glare of her publicity, her uncorrected, unrelated state. There had been moments, as I moved about the country, when she had seemed to me for affirmation of presence, for immunity from competition, fairly to share the field, but with the bagman, and fairly to speak as my inward ear had at last heard him speak. Ah, once place me, and y'all see I shall be different, I shall be better, for since I am with my preposterous position, falsely beguiled, pitilessly forsaken, thrust forth in my ignorance, and folly, what do I know, helpless chit, as I can but be about manners, or tone about proportion, or perspective about modesty, or mystery, about a condition of things that involves for the interest and the grace of life other forms of existence than this poor little mine pathetically broken reed, as it is just to find itself waving all alone in the wind. How can I do all the grace, all the interest, as I am expected toys, literally all the interest that isn't the mere interest on the money I am expected to supply it all while I wander and stray in the desert? Was there ever such a conspiracy on the part of a whole social order toward the exposure of incompetence, were ever crude youth and crude presumption left so unadmonished as to their danger of giving themselves away, who, at any turn, for an hour ever pityingly overshadows or dispossesses me, by what combination of other presences ever am I disburdened, ever relegated, and reduced, ever restored, in a word, to my right relation to the whole? All I want, that is all I need, for there is perhaps a differences, to put it simply, that my parents and my brothers and my male cousins should consent to exist otherwise than occultly, undiscoverably, or as I suppose you'd call it, irresponsibly. That's a trouble, yes, but we take it, so why shouldn't they? The restant you 432 make it out, for mew'd come of itself, haven't I? However, as it has been too long abandoned, and too much betrayed, isn't it too late? And am I not, don't you think, practically lost faintly, and from far away as through dense interpositions, this questioning wail of the maiden's ultimate distressed consciousness seemed to reach me, but I had steeled my sense, as I have said, against taking it in, and I did no more at the moment than all pensively suffer it again to show me the American social order in the guise of a great blank unnatural mother, a compound of all the recreant individuals misfitted with the name, whose ear the mystic plaint seemed never to penetrate, and whose large unseeing complacency suggested some massive monument, covered still with the thick cloth that precedes a public unveiling. We wonder at the hidden marble or bronze, we suppose under the cloth some attitude or expression appropriate to the image, but as the removal of the cloth is perpetually postponed, the character never emerges. The American mother, enshrouded in her brown holland, has by this analogy never emerged, only the daughter is meanwhile seated for the inspection of the world at the base of the pedestal, hypothetically supporting some weight, some mass or other, and we may each impute to her for this posture the aspect we judge best to beseem her. My point here, at any rate, is that I had quite forgotten her by the time I was seated after dinner that evening on a bench in the small public garden that formed a prospect for my hotel at Jacksonville. The air was divinely soft, it was such a southern night as I had dreamed of, and the only oddity was that we had come to it by so simple a process. We had traveled indeed all day, but the process seemed simple when there was nothing of it, nothing to speak of, to remember, nothing that succeeded in getting over the footlights, as the phrase goes, of the 433 great moving proscenium of the Pullman. I seemed to think of it, the wayside imagery, as something that had been there, no doubt, as the action or the dialogue are presumably there, in some untoward drama that spends itself at the back of the stage, that goes off in a passion at side doors and perhaps even bursts back incoherently through windows. But that doesn't reach the stall in which you sit, never quickens to acuteness your sense of what is going on, so as if the chair in the Pullman had been my stall, my sense had been all day, but of intervening heads, and tuning fiddles of queer refreshments, such as only the theater and the Pullman know, offered with vociferation, straight through the performance. I was a little uncertain afterwards as to when I had become distinctively aware of Florida, but the scenery of the state up to the point of my first pause for the night had not got over the footlights. I was promptly, however, to make good this loss. I felt myself doing so quite with intensity under the hot-looking stars at Jacksonville. I had come out to smoke for the evening's end, and it mattered not a scrap that the public garden was new and scant and crude, and that Jacksonville is not a name to conjure with. I still could sit there quite in the spirit for the hour of Byron's immortal question as to the verity of his Italian whereabouts. Was this the Mincio, were those the distant turrets of Verona, and should I sup well if the train to Palm Beach, arriving there on the morrow in time, should happen to permit me at Jacksonville? I had, as I say, already supped, but I projected myself for the time after Byron's manner into the exquisite sense of the dream come true. I was not to sup at all, as it proved at Palm Beach be the operation of one of those odd anomalous rigors that crop up even by the more flowery paths of American travel. But I was meanwhile able, I found to be quite Byronically foolish about the St. John's River, and the 434 various structures, looming now through the darkness, that more or less adorned its banks. The river served for my minciohitch, it moreover so greatly surpassed in extent and beauty, while the remoter buildings figured sufficiently any old city of the South, for that was the charm that, so preposterously with the essential notes of the impression, so happily struck the velvet, ere the extravagant plants the palms, oranges the cacti, the architectural fountain, the florid local monument, the cheap and easy exoticism, the sense as of people feeding off in the background, very much al fresco, that is on queer things, and with flaring light zone, might almost have been in a corner of Naples, or of Genoa. Everything is relativeth is illuminating commonplace. The clue to any just perception of effects anywhere came up for the 1000th time, by the aid of which I easily made out that absolute and impeccable poetry of sight and circumstance is far to seek, but that I was now immeasurably nearer to some poetic, or say, even to some romantic effect in things than I had hitherto been, and I had tried to think Washington relaxed and Richmond itself romantic, and Charleston secretly ardent. There always comes to any traveler who doesn't depart and arrive with the mere security and punctuality of a registered letter, some moment for his beginning to feel within him it happens, under some particular touched finer vibration, of a sense of the real thing he thus knows. It when it comes, and it has the great value that it never need fail. There is no situation, wherever he may turn, in which the note of that especial reality, the note of character for bliss or bale, may not insist on emerging. The note of Florida emerged for me, then, on the vulgar little dusty Jacksonville Piazzetta, where other vague persons sat about amid those spiky subtropical things that show how the South can be stiff as nothing else is stiff, while my rich sense of it incited me to resent the 435 fact that my visit had been denounced in advance as of an ungenerous brevity. I had few days, deplorably few no doubt, to spend, but it was afterwards positive to me that with my image, as regards the essence of the matter, richly completed, I had virtually foretasted it all on my dusky Jacksonville bench, and in my tepid Jacksonville stroll. Such reserves, in a complex of few interweavings, must impose themselves, I think, even upon foolish fondness, and Florida was quite remorselessly to appear to me a complex of few interweavings. Roman 3. The next day, for instance, was all occupied with but one of these. The railway run from Jacksonville to Palm Beach begins early and ends late, yet I waited the livelong time for any other factor than that of the dense cypress swamp, to show so much as the tip of an ear. I had quite counted on being thrilled by this very intensity and monotony of the characteristic note, and I doubtless was thrilled. I invoked, I cultivated the thrill, as we went by every itinerant art that experience had long since taught me, yet with a presentiment, all the while, of the large field in the whole impression that this simplicity would cover possible diversions doubtless occurred had the attuned spirit been moved to avail itself. Ormond, for instance, off to our right, put in toward the dim center of the stretch a claim as large as a hard white racing beach, an expanse of firm sand 30 miles long, could make it. This, I recognized, might well be an appeal of the grand and simple order, the huge band of shining silver beside the huge band of sapphire sea, and I inquired a little as to what filled in the picture. Oh, the motor cars, the bicycles, and the trotting wagons tearing up and down, and then, as 436 one seemed perhaps to yearn for another touch, the hotels, of course, a plenty of them, plenty of people, very popular resort. It sounded charming with its hint again of 2 or 3 great facts of composition, so definite that their paucity constituted somehow a mild majesty, but it ministered none the less to a reflection I had already on occasion found myself perhaps a little perversely making. One was liable in the States on many a scene to react as it were from the people, and to throw one's self passionately on the bosom of contiguous nature. Whatever surface it might happen to offer, one was apt to be moved in possibly almost invidious preference, or in deeper and sweeter confidence, to try what might be made of that, yet all unreasonably, when any source of interest did express itself in these mere rigorous terms, in these online terms, all of elimination just of sea and sky, and river breast and forest, and beach. The beaches in especial were to acquire a trick of getting on one's nerves that produced in turn a wanton wonder about the human side, and a due recurrence to the fact that the human side had been from the first one's affair. So therefore one seemed destined a bit incoherently to proceed asking oneself again and again what the play would have been without the scenery, sometimes even such scenery, and then once more not quite seeing why such scenery in especial should propose to put one off with so little of a play, the thing. Absolutely everywhere was to provide one's own play, everything made scenery for that. And the recurrence of such questions made scenery. Most of all I remember no moment over the land, when the mere Pullman itself didn't overarch my observations as a positive temple of the drama, and when the comedy and the tragedy of manners didn't under its dome hold me raptly attent, with which there were other resource, rising tide 437, that before we got to Palm Beach floated me back into remembered depths of youth. Why shouldn't I hold it not trivial that as the day waned and the evening gathered, and the heat increased, and my companions removed one after the other the articles of clothing that had consorted with our early start, I felt myself again beneath the spell of Mayne Reid captain, of the treasure ship of romance, and idol of my childhood. I might again have held in my very hand the war trail, a work that had seemed matchless to my 14th year, for was not the train itself rumbling straight into that fantastic Florida, with its rank vegetation, and its warm, heroic, amorous air, the Florida of the Seminoles, and the Everglades of the high old Spanish dons, and the passionate Creole beauties, gracing the primal society of Isolina de Vargas, whose voluptuous form was lashed maze-like at the climax of her fortunes to the fiery mustang of the wilderness, and so let loose adown the endless vista of our young suspense. We had thus food for the mind, I recall, if we were reduced to that, and I remember that as my buffet car, there was none other was hours late the fond vision of the meal crown of the endless day awaiting me ultimately at the famous hotel, yielded all the inspiration necessary for not appealing again, great though the stress and strain, to the indescribable charity of the buffet. The produce of the buffet, the procedure of the buffet were alike, wherever resorted to a sordid mockery of desire, so I but suffered desire to accumulate, till the final charming arrest the platform of the famous hotel, amid generous lights and greetings, and excellent arrangements, and balmy southern airs, and the breath of the near sea, and the vague crests of great palms, announced the fulfillment of every hope. The question of whether one's hope was really fulfilled, or of whether one had among all those items of ease to go supperless to bed, would doubtless appear beneath the 438 dignity of even such history as this, were it not for a single fact which then, and there looming large to me, blocked out on the spot all others. It is difficult to render the intensity with which one felt the great sphere of the hotel close round one, covering one in, as with high shining crystal, walls stretching beneath one's feet, an immeasurable polished level revealing itself, in short, as for the time, for the place, the very order of nature, and the very form, the only one of the habitable world. The effect was like nothing else of the sort one had ever known, and of surpassing interest truly, as any supreme illustration of manners, any complete and organic projection of a social case, is apt to be. The whole picture presented itself, as fresh and luminous as was natural to phenomena shown in the splendid Florida light, and off there, at the end of a huge peninsula especially appointed to them, and kept clear in their interest, as it struck me, of any shadow of anything but themselves. One had been aware enough certainly for long years of that range of American aspects, that diffusion of the American example, to which one had given from far back for convenience the name of hotel civilization. Why accordingly was this renewed impression so hugely to impose itself? Why was it to the eye of the restless analyst to stand for so much more than ever yet? Why was it above all so to succeed in making with insistence its appeal, an appeal, if not to the finer essence of interest, yet to several of the fond critic's livelier sensibilities? Wasn't, for that matter, his asking of such questions as these the very state of being interested, and all the more that the general reply to them was not easy to throw off? The vision framed, the reflections suggested, corresponded closely with those to which in New York some weeks before, on its harsh winter afternoon, the Waldorf Astoria had prescribed such a revel. But it was wondrous 439, that if I had there supposed the apogee of the impression, or better still of the expression, reached, I was here to see the whole effect written lucidly. Larger the difference was doubtless that of the crowded air and encumbered ground in the great northern city, and the fact that the demonstration is made in Florida, as in a vast clean void expressly prepared, for it has nothing either in nature or in man to reckon with. It carries everything before it, meaning, when I say it in this momentarily indefinite way, the perfect, the exquisite adjustability of the national life to the sublime hotel spirit, the whole appearance operates, as by an economy so thorough that no element of either party to the arrangement is discoverably sacrificed, neither is mutilated docked in. Any degree of its identity, its amplitude of type nothing, is left unexpressed, in either through its relation with the other. The relation would in fact seem to stimulate each to a view of the highest expression as yet open to it. The advantaging the sense of the upper hand may, indeed, be, at a few points, most with the hotel spirit, as the more concentrated of the two, there being so much that is comparatively undeveloped and passive in the social organism to which it looks for response, and the former agency by its very nature full-blown and expert trying it on the latter, much more than the latter is ever perceptibly moved to try it on the former. The hotel spirit is an omniscient genius, while the character of the tributary nation is still, but struggling into relatively dim self-knowledge. An illustration of this met me precisely at the very hour of my alighting. One had entered toward 10 o'clock. In the evening, the hotel world it had become the all in all and made, and imposed its law. This took the form for me at that hungry climax at the end of the long ordeal of the buffet car, of a refusal of all food, that night a rigor so inexorable that had 440 it not been for the charity of admirable friends, able to provide me from a private store, I should have had to go amid all the suggestions of everything fasting, and faint to bed there. One seemed to get the hotel spirit taking the advantage taking it unfairly, for whereas it struck me in general as educative distinctly, in respect to the society it deals with, keeping for the most part well in advance of it, and leading it on to a larger view of the social interest and opportunity than might otherwise accrue here, surely it was false to its mission. It fell behind its pretension, its general pretension, not only of meeting all American ideals, but of creating the Waldorf Astoria, being in this sense, for example, a perfect riot of creation, new and superior. One's its basis in those high developments is not that it merely gratifies them as soon as they peep out, but that it lies in wait for them, anticipates, and plucks them forth even before they dawn, setting them up almost prematurely, and turning their face in the right direction. Thus the great national ignorance of many things is artfully and benevolently practiced upon. Thus it is converted into extraordinary appetites such as can be but expensively sated. The belated traveler's appetite for the long-deferred bite could scarce be described as too extraordinary, but the great collective plastic public, so vague, yet about many things, didn't know that it didn't know that in communities more knowing, the great glittering costly caravansary, where the scale of charges is an implication of a high refinement of service, grave lapses are not condoned. One appears ridiculously to be regretting that unsupplied mouthful, but the restless analyst had in truth quickly enough left it behind, feeling in his hand, already, as a clue, the long concatenation of interlinked appearances. Things, short in themselves, might yet have such large dimensions of meaning. The revelation 441, practically dazzling to the uninformed many, was constantly proving right and left, if one gave it time, a trick played on the informed few, and there was no quarter of the field, either the material or the social, in which that didn't sooner or later come out the fact that the individual, with his preferences, differences, habits, accidents, might still fare imperfectly, even where the crowd could be noted as rejoicing before the Lord more ingenuously than on any other human scene, added but another touch to one's impression, already so strong, of the success with which throughout the land, even in conditions which might appear likely on certain sides to beget reserves about it, the all gregarious and generalized life suffices to every need. I by no means say that it is not touching the so largely witless confidence with which the universal impulse hurls its victims into the abyss of the hotel spirit, trusting it so blandly, and inviting it to throw up round and about them, and far and wide, the habitable, the practicable, the agreeable sphere toward which other arts of construction fail. There were lights in which this was to strike me as one of the most affecting of all social exhibitions, lights positively, in which I seemed to see again, as once more at the universal Waldorf Astoria, the whole-housed populace move, as in mild and consenting suspicion of its captured and governed state, its having to consent to inordinate fusion, as the price of what it seemed pleased to regard as inordinate luxury, beguiled, and caged, positively thankful in its vast vacancy for the sense and the definite horizon of a cage. Were there yet not moments, were there yet not cases and connections in which it still dimly made out that its condition was the result of a compromise, into the detail of which there might some day be an alarm, in entering the detail of the compromise exacted of the individual throughout American life, affects the 442 observer as a great cumulative sum growing and growing while he awaits time and opportunity to go into it. And I asked myself again and again, if I couldn't imagine the shadow of that quantity, by no means oppressively felt, yet already vaguely perceived, and reflected a bit portentously in certain aspects of the native consciousness. The jealous cultivation of the common mean only the reduction of everything to an average of decent suitability, the gospel of precaution against the dangerous tendency, latent in many things to become too good for their context, so that persons partaking of them may become too good for their company's idealized form. Of all this glimmered for me as an admonition, or a betrayal, through the charming Florida radiance, constituting really the greatest interest of the lesson one had traveled so far to learn. It might superficially seem absurd, it might savor almost of blasphemy, to put upon the romantic peninsula the affront of that particular prosaic meaning. But I profess that none of its so sensibly thin sources of romancethan, because everywhere asking more of the imagination than they could be detected in giving it appealed to me with any such force or testified in any such quantity. Definitely, one had made one's pilgrimage, but to find the hotel spirit in sole articulate possession and call this truth for the mind an anticlimax, if one would none of the various climaxes, the minor effects those of nature for instance, since thereabouts far and wide, was no hinted history struck me, as for a moment dispossessing it of supremacy, so little availed comparatively those of the jungle, the air, the sea, the sky, the sunset, the orange, the pineapple, the palm, so little such a one amid all the garden climaxes, as that of the divine bougainvillea which here and there at Palm Beach smothers whole homes in its purple splendor. 443. For the light of the hotel spirit really beat upon everything, it was the only torch held up for the view, or the sense of anything else. The case therefore was perfect. For what did this mean? But that its conscience, so to speak, its view of its responsibility, would be of the highest, and that given the whole golden frame of the picture, the appearances could be nowhere else so grandly in its favor, that prevision was to be in fact afterwards confirmed to me. Roman 4s. On a strip of sand between the sea and the jungle, in one quarter between the sea and the lake, in another, the clustered hotels, the superior pair in a special stand, and exhale their genius. One of them, the larger, the more portentously brave of the pair, is a marvel, indeed proclaiming itself, of course, with all the eloquence of an interminable towered, and pinnacled, and gabled, and bannered skyline, the biggest thing of its sort in the world. Such is the responsive geniality begotten by its apparently perfect adequacy to this pretension, or to any other it might care to put forth, that one took it easily as leaving far behind mere figures of speech and forms of advertisement to stand off and see it rear its incoherent crest above its gardens, was to remember and quite with relief nothing but the processional outline of Windsor Castle that could appear to march with it. I say with relief, because the value of the whole affirmation, which was but the scale otherwise expressed, seemed thereby assured. No world but an hotel world could flourish in such a shadow. Every step for a mile or two round conduced but to show how it did flourish, every aspect of everything for which our reclaimed patch, our liberal square between sea and jungle yielded space, was a 444 demonstration of that. The gardens and groves, the vistas and avenues between the alignments of palms, the fostered insolence of flame-colored flower and golden fruit, were perhaps the rarest attestation of all so recent a conquest. This seemed to me of ground formerly abandoned in the States to the general indifference there came back to me from other years. A vision of the rude and sordid margins, the untended approaches surrounding at resorts the crowded caravansary of the earlier time, and marking, even now, I inferred those of the type that still survive, and I caught verily at play that best virtue of the potent presence the hotel was leading again, not following, imposing the standard, not submitting to it, teaching the affluent class how to garden, how in fact to tidy up its yard, since affluence alone was supposable there, not receiving at other hands the lesson it was doing more than this, discriminating in favor of the beautiful, and above all in favor of the refined, with an energy that again, in the most interesting way, seemed to cause the general question of the future of beauty in America to heave in its unrest. 50 times already, I had felt myself catching this vibration, received some vivid impression of the growing quantity of force available for that conquest of all the latent powers of freedom, of space, of wealth, of faith and knowledge and curiosity, verily perhaps even of sustained passion potentially at its service. These possibilities glimmer before one at times in presence of some artistic effect expensively yet intelligently, yet even charmingly produced, with the result of your earnestly saying, why not more and more then? Why not an immense exploration and immense exhibition of such possibilities? What is wanting for it, after all, in the way of just there? It is indeed that you pull yourself yupa, in the way of what you are conscious, that what you 445 recognize in a special is not so much the positive as the negative strength of the case. What you see is the space, and the freedom which at every turn in America make one yearn to take other things for granted. The ground is so clear of preoccupation, the air so clear of prejudgment and doubt that you wonder why the chance shouldn't be as great for the aesthetic revel. As for the political and economic, why some great undaunted adventure of the arts, meeting in its path, none of the aged lions of prescription of proscription of merely jealous tradition, should not take place in conditions unexampled from the moment. It is but a question of some ones of everyone's caring. Where was the conceivable quantity of care? Where were the means and chances of application ever so great? And the precedent, the analogy of the universal organizing passion, the native aptitude for putting affairs through indubitably haunts you. You are so aware of the acuteness and the courage that you fall but a little short of figuring them as aesthetically contributive. But you do fall short. You remember in time that great creations of taste and faith never express themselves primarily in terms of mere convenience and zeal, and that all the waiting money and all the general fury have at the most the sole value of being destined to be good for beauty, when it shall appear they have it in them so little by themselves, to make it appear that your unfinished question arrives easily enough in that light at its end. What is wanting in the way of taste is the right form of the inquireth that small circumstance alone, being positively contributive, the others the boundless field, the endless gold, the habit of great enterprises, are you feel at most simple negations of difficulty, they affect you none the less however, as a rank of stalwart soldiers and servants, who as they stand at attention plead from wistful eyes to be enrolled, and used so that before any 446 embodied symptom of the precious principle, they are there in the background of your thought. These lingering instants spent in the presence of such symptoms, these brief moments of aesthetic irresoluble, to occur in the most diverse connection-shaven interest that quite picks them, I think, from the heap of one's American hours, and the interest is always fine throwing one back, as by a further turn, it usually does on the question of the trick, possibly played for your appreciation, by mere negation of difficulty. To what extent may the absence of difficulty, to what extent may not facility of purchase, and sweet simplicity of pride surprise you into taking them momentarily, for a demonstration of taste you remain on your guard, very properly. But the interest, as I have called it, doesn't flag none the less, since there is one mistake, into which you never need fall, and one charming, one touching appearance, that you may take as representing wherever you meet it a reality, when once you have interpreted the admonitory sign I have just named as the inordinate desire for taste, a desire breaking into a greater number of quaint and candid forms, probably, than have ever been known upon earth. The air is in a manner clearer, and you know sufficiently where you are. Isn't it cleared, moreover, beyond doubt, to the positive increase of the interest, and doesn't the question then become almost thrillingly that of the degree to which this pathos of desire may be condemned to remain a mere heartbreak to the historic muse? Is that to be possibly the American future? So far as over such a mystery of mysteries glibness may be permitted, the fascination grows, while you wonder as from the moment you have begun to go into the matter at all wonder you certainly must, if with difficulties so conjured away by power, the clear vision, the creative freshness, the real thing, in a word, shall have to continue to be represented indefinitely. But by a 447 gilded yearning, the inference is then irresistible that these blessings are indeed of their essence a sovereign rarity, if with so many of the conditions they yet hang back. On what particular occult furtherance must they not incorruptibly depend? What are the other elements that make for them? And in what manner, and at what points does the wrong combination of such elements on the American scene work for frustration in trancing speculation, which has brought me back by a long circuit to the shining marble villa on the edge of Lake Worth? I was about to allude to this wondrous creation as the supreme instance of missionary effort on the part of the hotel spirit bee, which I mean of the effort to illustrate and embody a group of its ideals, to give a splendid concrete example of its ability to flower at will into concentration, into conspicuous privacy, into a care for all the refinements. The palace rears itself behind its own high gates and gilded transparent barriers, At a few minutes' walk from the great caravanseries, it sits there in its admirable garden amid its statues, and fountains the hugeness of its more or less antique vases and sarcophagicosliest reproductions, alas, if to put to shame those remembered villas of the Lake of Como of the Borromean Islands. The type, the climate, the horticultural elegance, the contained curiosities, luxuries, treasures, of which it invokes only to surpass them at every point new with that consistency of newness which one sees only in the States. It seems to say somehow that to some such heaven, some such public exaltation of the blessed, those who have conformed with due earnestness to the hotel spirit, and for a sufficiently long probation, may hope eventually to penetrate or perhaps actually retire. It is sprung from the genius of the divine pair, the Dioscuri themselves, Castor and Pollux, were the sons 448 of Zeus, and has this above all of exemplary, that whereas one had in other climes and countries often seen the proprietor of estates construct an hotel or hotels on a piece of his property, and even when rigid need was in proximity to his home, one had not elsewhere seen the home adjoined to the hotel, and placed with such magnificence under its protection, and as one might say its star in the former cassate was easy to reflect there had been ever at best an effect of incoherence, while the beauty of logic of the strictly consequent was all on the side of the latter, so much as that one may say, but I should find it hard to express without some air of extravagance my sense of the beauty of the lesson, read to the general Palm Beach consciousness, from behind the gilded gates, and between the large interstices of the enclosure. It had the immense merit that it was suited admirably to borders. It preached them the gospel of civilization all in their own terms, and without the waste of an accent. It was in short the apotheosis, the ideal form of the final home that may pretend to crown a career of sufficiently expensive boarding. Anything less gorgeous wouldn't have been proportioned to so much expense, nor anything more sequestered in the key of such a mode of life. But I detach myself with reluctance from the view of this interesting creation, interesting in its sense of bathing the whole question of manners in a light. Anything that does that is a boon to the restless analyst, and I remember rejoicing that he should have been introduced promptly to the Marble Palace, which struck him as rewarding attention. The more attention was privileged, and the further it might penetrate such an experience, was all properly preliminary to a view of the rest of the scene, since otherwise frankly in relation to what it all represented ideal were the borders in their vast multitude to be viewed. For the borders verily were the great indicated 449 show, as I had gathered in advance at Palm Beach. It had been promised one on all sides, that there as nowhere else in America, one would find Vanity Fair in full blast, and Vanity Fair, not scattered, not discriminated, and parceled out as among the comparative privacies and ancientries of Newport, but compressed under one vast cover, enclosed in a single huge vitrine, which there would be nothing to prevent one's flattening one's nose against for days of delight. It was into Vanity Fair accordingly that one embraced every opportunity to press. It was the boarders frankly who engaged one's attention in default of any great array of other elements. The other elements, it must be confessed, strike the visitor as few. He has soon come to the end of them, even though they consist of the greater part of the rest of the sense of Florida, and he seems to himself to pursue them mainly at the tail, and in the constant track of the borders. These latter are so numerous, and the clearing in the jungle so comparatively minute, that there is scant occasion for the wandering apart which always forms under the law of the herd. The intenser joy, the velvet air, the color of the sea, the royal palms clustered here and there, and in their nobleness of beauty, their single sublime distinction, putting every other mark and sign to the blush. These are the principal figures of the Sympathies, with the custom of the short dip into the jungle at 2 or 3 points of which, approached by charming winding woodways, the small but genial fruit farm offers it in all the succulence of the admirable pale-skinned orange, and the huge sun-warmed grapefruit plucked from the low bough where it fairly bumps your cheek, for solicitation and partaken of on the spot, as the immortal ladies of Cranford partook of dessert with a few steps aside the back turned, and a betrayed ingurgitation. It is by means of a light perambulator of adult size, but constructed 450 of wickerwork, and pendant from a bicycle propelled by robust Negro, that the jungle is thus visited. The bicycle follows the serpentine track, the secluded ranch is swiftly reached, the peaceful retirement of the cultivators multitudinously admired, the perambulator promptly re-entered, the darky restored to the saddle, and his charge again to the hotel. It is all most agreeable and diverting It is almost the borders apart romantic, but it is soon over, and there is not much more of it. The uncanny conception, the rank eccentricity of a walk, encounters neither favor nor facility, but, on the subject of the inveteracy with which the conditions over the land conspire against that sweet subterfuge, there would be more to say than I may here deal with. One of these gentle ranches was approached by water as Palm Beach has a front on its vast fresh lake, as well as seaward a steam launch puts you down at the garden foot, and the place is less infested by the borders, less confessedly undefended, less artlessly ignorant, in fine, thanks perhaps to the mere interposing water of any possible right to occultation, the general absence of conception of that right, nowhere, asserted nowhere, embodied everywhere, in fact quite sacrificially abrogated, qualifying at last your very sense of the American character, qualifying it very much as a pervading unsaltedness qualifies the taste of a dinner. This brief excursion remains with me at any rate as a delicate and exquisite impression, the neck of land that stretched from the languid lake to the anxious sea, the approach to real detachment, the gracious northern hostess, just veiled for the right felicity in a thin nostalgic sadness, the precious recall, in particular, of 451, having succeeded in straying a little through groves of the pensive palm, down to the sandy, the vaguely troubled shore. There was a certain concentration in the hour, a certain intensity in the note, a certain intimacy in the whole communion. I found myself loving quite fraternally the palms, which had struck me at first for all their human-headed gravity, as merely dry and taciturn, but which became finally as sympathetic as so many rows of puzzled philosophers disheveled, shock-pated with the riddle of the universe. This scantness and sweetness and sadness, this strange peninsular spell, this, I said, was subtropical Floridon, doubtless, as permitted a glimpse, as I should ever have of any such effect. The softness was divine, like something mixed in a huge silver crucible as an elixir, and then liquidly scattered, but the refinement of the experience would be the summer noon or the summer night. It would be then the breast of nature would open, save only that so lost in it, and with such lubrication of surrender, how should one ever come back? As it was, one came back soon enough, back to one's proper business, which appeared to be urgently, strictly, severely, the pursuit of the boarders up and down the long corridors, and round about the wide verandas of their crowded career. I had been admirably provided for at the less egregious of the two hotels, which was vast and cool and fair, friendly, breezy, shiny, swabbed and burnished like a royal yacht, really immaculate and delightful, full of interesting lights, and yet standing, but on the edge of the whirlpool, the center of which formed the heart of the adjacent colossus. One could plunge, by a short walk through a luxuriance of garden, into the deeper depths. One could lose one's self, if so minded, in the labyrinth of the other show there. If Vanity Fair was not encamped, it was not for want of booths. The long corridors were streets 452 of shops, dealing naturally in commodities, almost beyond price, not the cheap gimcracks of the usual watering place barrack, but solid, when not elaborately ethereal, formidable, incalculable values, of which it was of an admonitory economic interest to observe the triumphant appeal. They hadn't terrors, apparently, for the clustered borders, these idols and monsters of the market, neither the wild fantastications of the milliner, the uncovered fires, disclosed secrets of the gem merchant, the errant tapestries and bahuts of the antiquarian, nor what I found most impressive, and what has everywhere its picture-making force, those ordered dispositions and stretched lengths of old point, in the midst of which a quiet lady in black, occupied with some small stitch of her own, is apt to raise at you with expensive deliberation a grave white Flemish face. The interest of the general spectacle was supposed to be, I had gathered, that people from all parts of the country contributed to it, and the value of the testimony as to manners was that it brought to a focus so many elements of difference. The elements of difference, whatever they might latently have been, struck me as throughout forcibly simplified by the conditions of the place. This prompt reducibility of 1,000 figures to a common denominator having been, in fact, to my sense, the very moral of the picture. Individuality and variety is attributed to types in America on easy terms, and the reputation for it enjoyed on terms not more difficult, so that what I was most conscious of, from aspect to aspect, from group to group, from sex to sex, from one presented border to another, was the continuity of the fusion, the dimness of the distinctions. The distinction that was least absent, however, would have been, I judge, that of the comparative ability to spend and purchase, the ability to spend with freedom being, as one made out, a positive consistent with all sorts of negatives, that helped to make the whole 453 thing documentarithet, you had to be financially more or less at your ease to enjoy the privileges of the Royal Poinciana, at all enjoy them, through their extended range of saloons and galleries fields of high publicity, all pursue them, from dining halls, to music rooms, to ballrooms, to cardrooms, to riding rooms, to a succession of places of convenience and refreshment, not the least characteristic of which no doubt was the terrace appointed to mid-morning and mid-afternoon drinks at the latter hour, that appeared oddly never to comprise tea, the only one appreciated in Europe at that time of day. The quest of tea, indeed, especially at the hour when it is most a blessing struck me as attended throughout the country, with difficulties even with dangers over ground, where one's steps are beset everywhere, with an infinite number of strange, sweet-iced liquiditous of these. I hasten to add charmingly congruous in their non-alcoholic ingenuity, with the heats of summer a circumstance that doesn't prevent their flourishing equally in the rigor of cold. The implication of ease was thus a light to assist inquiry. It is always a gained fact about peoples, to where they are if not as to who or what that, they are either in confirmed or in casual possession of money, and thereby presumably of all that money may, in this negotiable world represent, add to this, that the company came in its provided state, by common report from all over, that it converged upon Palm Beach from every prosperous corner of the land. And the case was clear for a compendious view of American society, in the largest sense of the term society as we loosely use the word is made up of the fortunate few, and if that number be everywhere small at the best it was, yet the fortunate, who after their fashion filled the frame every obligation lay upon me, to study them as so gathered in. And I did my utmost, I remember 454, to render them that respect yet, when I now after an interval consult my notes, I find the page a blank, and when I knock at the door of memory, I find it perversely closed, if it consents a little to open, rather a countenance looks out that of the inscrutable warden of the precinct and seems to show me the ambiguous smile that accompanies on occasion the plea to be excused. From which I infer that the form and pressure of the borders for all I had expected of the promised picture failed somehow to affect me as a discussable quantity. It is of the nature of many American impressions, accepted at the time, as a whole of the particular story simply to cease to be as soon as your back is turned to fade to pass away, to leave not a wreck behind. This happens not least when the image, whatever it may have been, has exacted the tribute of wonder or pleasure. It has displayed every virtue but the virtue of being able to remain with you. Its pressure and power have failed of some weight, some element of density or intensity, some property or quality in short, that makes for the authority of a figure, for the complexity of a scene, the European vision in general of whatever consisting, and even when making less of an explicit appeal, has behind it a driving force derived from sources into which I won't pretend here to enter that make it comparatively bite, as the plate of the etcher is bitten, by aquafortis that doubtless is the matter. The states with the vast peaceful and prosperous human show and conditions, especially in which its peace and prosperity most shine out, it registers itself on the plate with an incision too vague, and above all too uniform. The paucity of one's notes is in itself no doubt a report of the consulted oracle. It describes and reconstitutes for me the array of the borders, this circumstance, that I only grope for their features, and seek in vain to discriminate 455 between sorts and conditions. There were the two sexes, I think, and the range of age, but once the one comprehensive type was embraced, no other signs of differentiation. How should there have been when the men were consistently, in all cases, thoroughly obvious products of the business block unmitigated by any other influence definite enough to name, and the women were under the same strictness, the indulged ladies of such lords? The business block has perhaps from the northeast to the southwest its fine diversities, but any variety so introduced eluded even the most brooding of analysts. And it was not, of course, that the marks of uniformity among so many persons were not on their side perfectly appreciable. It was only that when one had noted them as marks of success, no doubt primarily, and then as those of great gregarious decency and sociability and good humor, one had exhausted the list. It was the scant diversity of type that left me short as a story seeker or picture-maker, contributive as this very fact might be to admiration of the costly processes, as they thus appear that ensure, and that alone ensure in other societies, the opposite of that scantness. With this as the foredoomed observer may never escape from the dreadful faculty that rides him, The very simplifications had in the highest degree their illustrative value. They gave all opportunity to anything or anyone that might be salient. They gave it to the positive bourgeois. Propriety serenely, imperturbably, massively seated and against, which any experimental deviation from the bourgeois would have dashed itself in vain. This neutrality of respectability might have been figured by a great gray wash of some charged moist brush causing color and outline on the pictured paper effectually to run together. What resisted it best was the look of business success in some of the men, when that success had been very 456 great, and there were indicated cases of its prodigious greatness. The look was in its turn very great when it had been small on the other hand. There was doubtless no look at all since there were no other conceivable sources of appearance the people had not, and the women least of all one felt in general, been transferred from other backgrounds the scene around them, and behind them, constituted as replete a medium as they could ever have. Been conscious of the women in particular failed in an extraordinary degree to engage the imagination to offer it so to speak references or openings. It faltered doubtless respectfully enough where they, for the most part, so substantially and prosaically sat failing of any warrant to go an inch further. As for the younger persons, of whom there were many, as for the young girls in especial, they were as perfectly in their element as goldfish in a crystal jar, a form of exhibition, suggesting but one question or mystery: was it they who had invented it, or had it inscrutably invented them? Romans 6. The case of St. Augustine afterwards struck me as presenting on another side its analogy with the case at Palm Beach, if the social interest had in the latter place appeared, but of a weak constitution, so the historic at the former was to work a spell of a simpler sort than one had been brought up, as it were. To look to hadn't one been brought up from far back on the article of that faith in St. Augustine by periodical papers, in the magazine's fond elucidations of its romantic character, accompanied by drawings that gave one quite proudly, quite patriotically, to think that filled the cup of curiosity and yearning. The old town, for the essence of the faith had been that there was an old town receded 457 into an all but untraceable past. It had been of all American towns the earliest planted, and it bristled still with every evidence of its Spanish antiquity. The illustrations in the magazines, wondrous vignettes of old street vistas, old architectural treasures, gateways and ramparts, odds and ends, nooks and corners crowned with the sweetness of slow decay, conveyed the sense of these delights, and renewed at frequent intervals their appeal. But oh, as I was to observe the school of black and white, trained up by the magazines, has much in the American air to answer for it, points so vividly the homely moral, that when you haven't what you like you must perforce like, and above all misrepresent, what you have. Its translation of these perfunctory passions into pictorial terms saddles it with a weight of responsibility that would be greater. One can only say if there ever were a critic, some guardian of real values, to bring it to book. The guardians of real values struck me as up and down far to seek the whole matter. Indeed, would seem to come back interestingly enough to the general truth of the aesthetic need in the country for much greater values of certain sorts than the country and its manners, its aspects and arrangements, its past and present, and perhaps even future really supply, whereby, as the aesthetic need is also intermixed with a patriotic yearning, a supply has somehow to be extemporized by any pardonable form of pictorial hankapankahas, to be, as the expression goes, cleverly faked, but it takes an inordinate amount of faking to meet the supposed intensity of appetite of a body of readers, at once more numerous and less critical than any other in the world, so that, frankly, the desperate expedient is written large in much of the artistic activity of the country. The results are of the oddest, they hang all traceably together, wonderful, in short, the general spectacle, and 458 lesson of the scale and variety of the faking. They renew again the frequent admonition that the pabulum provided for a great thriving democracy may derive most of its interest from the nature of its testimony to the thriving democratic demand. No long time is required in the states to make vivid for the visitor the truth that the nation is almost feverishly engaged in producing with the greatest possible activity and expedition an intellectual pabulum after its own heart, and that not only the arts and ingenuities of the draftsman called upon to furnish the picturesque background and people it with the aristocratic figure, where neither of these revelations ever meets his eye, pay their extravagant tribute, but that those of the journalist, the novelist, the dramatist, the genealogist, the historian, are pressed as well for dear life into the service the illustrators of the magazines. Improvised largilithet is when not laboring in the cause of the rural. Dialects improvise the field of action full of features at any price, and the characters who figure upon it, young gods and goddesses, mostly of superhuman stature and towering. Pride the novelists improvise with the aid of the historians, a romantic local past of costume, and compliment and swordplay and gallantry and passion. The dramatists build up of 1,000 pieces the airy fiction, that the life of the people in the world among whom the elements of clash and contrast are simplest, and most superficial abounds in the subjects and situations and effects of the theater, while the genealogists touch up the picture with their pleasant hint of the number over the land of families of royal blood. All this constitutes a vast home-grown provision for entertainment, rapidly superseding any that may be borrowed or imported, and that indeed already begins not invisibly to press for exportation. As to quantity, it looms immense and resounds in proportion, yet with the property, all its own 459, of ceasing to be of fading like the mist of dawn, that is of giving no account of itself whatever is, soon as one turns on it any intending eye of appreciation or of inquiry. It is the public these appearances collectively refer us to that becomes thus again the more attaching subject, the public so placidly uncritical that the widest thread of the deceptive stitch never makes it blink and sentimental at once, with such inveteracy and such simplicity, that finding everything everywhere perfectly splendid it fairly goes upon its knees to be humbugingly humbugged. It proves ever by the ironic measure quite incalculably young. That perhaps was all that had been the matter with it, in presence of the immemorial legend of St. Augustine. As a mine of romance, St. Augustine, proving primarily, and of course quite legitimately, but an hotel of the first magnitudian hotel, indeed so remarkable and so pleasant, that I wondered what call there need ever have been upon it to prove anything else. The Ponce de Leon, for that matter, comes as near producing all by itself, the illusion of romance as a highly modern, a most cleverly constructed and smoothly administered great modern caravansary, can come. It is largely in the Moorish style, as the cities of Spain preserve the record of that manner. It breaks out on every pretext into circular arches, and embroidered screens into courts and cloisters arcades, and fountains fantastic projections, and lordly towers, and is in all sorts of ways, and in the highest sense of the word, the most amusing of hotels. It did for me at St. Augustine. I was well aware everything that an hotel could do after which I could but appeal for further service to the old Spanish fort, the empty sunny grassy shell by the low pale shore, the mild time-silvered quadrilateral, that under the care of a single exhibitory veteran, and with the still milder remnant of a towngate, near it preserves alone 460, to any effect of appreciable emphasis, the memory of the Spanish occupation. One wandered there for meditation. It is not congruous with the genius of Florida, I gathered, to permit you to wander very far, and it was there perhaps that, as nothing prompted on the whole to intenser musings, I suffered myself to be set moralizing, in the manner of which I have just given an example, over the too thin projection of legend, the too dry response of association. The Spanish occupation, shortest of ineffectual chapters, seemed the ghost of a ghost and the burnt-out fire, but such a pinch of ashes as one might properly fold between the leaves of one's Baedeker. Yet if I made this remark, I made it without bitterness, since there was no doubt, under the influence of this last look, that Florida still had in her ingenuous, not at all insidious way the secret of pleasing, and that even round about me, the vagueness was still an appeal. The vagueness was warm, the vagueness was bright, the vagueness was sweet, being scented and flowered and fruited above all. The vagueness was somehow consciously and confessedly weak. I made out in it something of the look of the charming shy face that desires to communicate, and that yet has just too little expression. What it would fain say was that it really knew itself unequal to any extravagance of demand upon it, but that if it might so plead to one's tenderness, it would always do its gentle best. I found the plea for myself. I may declare exquisite and irresistible. The Florida of that particular tone was a Florida adorable. Romans 7. This last impression had indeed everything to gain from the sad rigor of steps, retraced an inevitable return to the north, in the interest of a directly subsequent, and thereby gracelessly roundabout move westward. And I 461 confess to having felt on that occasion, before the dire backwardness of the northern spring, as if I had while traveling in the other sense, but blasphemed against the want of forwardness of the southern. Every breath that one might still have drawn in the south might, if 20 other matters had been different, haunted me, as the thought of a lost treasure. And I settled at the eternal car window to the mere sightless contemplation, the forlorn view of an uglia, such an ugly wintering waiting world my eye, had perhaps been jaundiced by the breach of a happy spell inasmuch, as on thus leaving the sad fragments there where they had fallen I tasted again the quite saccharine sweetness of my last experience of Palm Beach, and knew how I should wish to note for remembrance the passage, supremely charged with that quality, in which it had culminated. I asked myself, what other expression I should find for the incident the afternoon, before I left the place of one of those mild progresses to the head of Lake Worth, which distill for the good children of the pair the purest poetry of their cup. The poetic effect had braved the compromising aid of the highlight-enveloped electric launch in which the pilgrim embarks, and braved as well the immitigable fact that his shrine at the end of a couple of hours is in the vast and exquisite void, but an institution of yesterday, a wondrous floating tea-house or restaurant, inflated again, with the hotel spirit and exhaling modernity at every pore. These associations are so far as association goes the only ones, but the whole impression for simply sitting there in the softest lap, the whole South had to offer seemed to me to dispense with any aid, but that of its own absolute felicity. It was for the late return, at least the return in the divine dusk, with the flushed west, at one's right a concert of but 2 or 3 notes alignment, against the golden sky of the individual black palms, a 462 frieze of chiseled ebony, and the texture for faintly brushed cheek and brow of an air of such silkiness of velvet, the very throne robe of the star-crowned night as one can scarce commemorate. But in the language of the loom, the shore of the sunset, and the palms, what was that meanwhile like? And yet with what did it at the moment? One asked the question, refused to have anything to do. It was like a myriad pictures of the Nile with much of the modern life of which it suggested more than one analogy. These indeed all dropped I found, before I had done it, would have been a Nile so simplified out of the various fine senses attachable. One had to put the case, I mean to make a fine sense, that here surely then was the greater antiquity of the two, the antiquity of the infinite previous of the time before pharaohs and pyramids, when everything was still to come. It was a Nile, in short, without the least little implication of a Sphinx, or still more if possible of a Cleopatra. I had the foretaste of what I was presently to feel in California. The general aspect of that wondrous realm kept suggesting to me a sort of prepared, but unconscious and inexperienced Italy, the primitive plate in perfect condition, but with the impression of history, all yet to be made. Of how grimly meanwhile, under the annual rigor, the world for the most part waits to be less ugly again, less despoiled of interest, less abandoned to monotony, less forsaken of the presence that forms its only resource of the one friend, to whom it owes all it ever gets of the pitying season that shall save it from its huge insignificancy off, so much as this no doubt, I sufficiently renewed my vision, and with plenty of the reviving ache of a question, already familiar, to what extent was hugeness, to what extent could it be a ground for complacency of view, in any country not visited for the very love of wildness, for positive joy in barbarism? 463. Where was the charm of boundless immensity, as overlooked from a car window, with the general pretension to charm, the general conquest of nature and space, affirmed immediately round about you by the general pretension of the Pullman, the great monotonous rumble of which seems forever to say to you, see what I am making of all this, what I am making, what I am making. I was to become later on still more intimately aware of the spirit of one's possible reply to that, but even then my consciousness served, and the eloquence of my exasperation seems in its rude accents to come back to me. I see what you are not making, oh, what you are ever so vividly not, and how can I help it, if I am subject to that lucidity which appears never so welcome to you for its measure of truth, as it ought to be? How can I not be so subject from the moment? I don't just irreflectively gape if I were one of the painted savages you have dispossessed, or even some tough reactionary, trying to emulate him. What you are making would doubtless impress me more than what you are leaving unmade, for in that case, it wouldn't be to you I should be looking in any degree for beauty, or for charm. Beauty and charm would be for me in the solitude you have ravaged, and I should owe you my grudge for every disfigurement, and every violence, for every wound with which you have caused the face of the land to bleed. No, since I accept your ravage, what strikes me is the long list of the arrears of your undone and so constantly right and left that your pretended message of civilization is but a colossal recipe for the creation of arrears, and of such as can but remain forever out of hand. You touch the great lonely land as one feels it still to bay only to plant upon it some ugliness about which, never dreaming of the grace of apology or contrition, You then proceed to brag with a cynicism, all your own. You convert the 464 large and noble sanities that I see around me. You convert them one after the other to crudities, to invalidities hideous and unashamed. And you so leave them to add to the number of the myriad aspects. You simply spoil of the myriad unanswerable questions that you scatter about as some monstrous unnatural mother might leave a family of unfathered infants on doorsteps or in waiting rooms. This is the meaning surely of the inveterate rule that you shall multiply the perpetrations you call place be the sign of some name as senseless mostly as them Silvesto, the sole end of multiplying to the eye, as one approaches every possible source of displeasure, when nobody cares or notices or suffers, by all one makes out when no displeasure by what one can see is ever felt or ever registered. Why shouldn't you may indeed ask be as much in your right as you need. But in that fact itself, that fact of the vast general unconsciousness and indifference looms for any restless analyst who may come along the accumulation on your hands of the unretrieved and the irretrievable. I remember how it was to come to me elsewhere in such hours, as those that south of Pennsylvania, for instance, or beyond the radius of Washington, I had caught no glimpse of anything that was to be called for more than a few miles, and by a stretch of courtesy, the honor, the decency, or dignity of a road that, most exemplary of all, civil creations and greater even as a note of morality, one often thinks than as a note of facility, and yet had nowhere heard these particular arrears spoken of as matters ever conceivably to be made up. I was doubtless aware that if I had been a beautiful red man with a tomahawk, I should of course have rejoiced in the occasional sandy track or in the occasional mud channel, just in proportion as they fell so short of the type. Only in that case, I shouldn't have been seated by the great square of plate glass through 465, which the missionary Pullman appeared to invite me to admire the achievements it proclaimed. It was in this respect the great symbolic agent. It seemed to stand for all the irresponsibility behind it, and I am not sure that I didn't continue so long as I was in it to slang it for relief of the o'er-fraught heart. You deal your wounds that is the trouble, as you say in numbers so out of proportion to any hint of responsibility for them, that you seem ever moved to take, which is the devil's dance precisely that your vast expanse of level floor leads you to caper through with more kinds of outward clumsiness even, if also with more kinds of inward impatience, and avidity more leaps and bounds of the spirit at any cost to grassathan, have ever before been collectively displayed the expanse of the floor. The material opportunity itself has elsewhere failed, so that what is the positive effect of their inordinate presence, but to make the lone observer here and there, but measure with dismay the trap laid by the scale, if he be not tempted even to say by the superstition of continuity, is the germ of anything finely human, of anything agreeably or successfully social, supposably planted in conditions of such endless stretching and such boundless spreading as shall appear finally to minister but to the triumph of the superficial and the apotheosis of the raw. For a split or a chasm, one groans beside your plate glass. For an unbridgeable abyss or an insuperable mountain, and I could so indulge myself, though still ignorant of how one was to groan later on in particular, after taking yet further home the portentous truth, that this same criminal continuity, scorning its grandest chance to break down, makes but a mouthful of the mighty Mississippi, that was to be in fact my very next big impression.